And the first item we have is a approval of the minutes of the February 8th regular meeting and the May 2nd joint Utilities Finance Commission meeting. Do I have any changes?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Just a couple of items before we start. Jim O'Connor and Ted Fletcher are unavailable today, as is Mike Falls. We had never gotten, the Utilities Commission did, but not ourselves, from Ted Fletcher an overview of the optimization of the electrical system, the reliability, and capital programs and status as they go forward. So when at a future date at the next meeting, I will have him come and discuss a total overview of the optimization, what impact it's going to have on the capital programs, what the status of the system is, what the changes are between reliability and cost in terms of a focus of operations.
And if I could, Mr. Chairman, I would like to share something I had said about that, the Utility Commission, when they discussed it. As far as the dollars for the capital projects, that is not really a conversation that lends itself to a standalone. That will actually come back before both boards in two different contexts. One, the 5-year capital plan is part of the budget. So as we go through the budget adoption process, that will have to be vetted and approved by council. Two, the 5-year capital plan is an integral part of the completion of the rate study. And so again, it can't be looked at sort of out of the context of the budget and its impact on the rates. That rate study will be coming back to both commissions later on this summer as well. And so in both of those cases, you'll have the opportunity to look at the dollars associated with the revised capital plan and with the impacts on the rates and the budget. In terms of the operational side, certainly that's something that only Ted and the operations guys can shed some light on in terms of the why of the capital projects. But how it affects the budgets going forward will be part of two other things that you'll see later this summer.
My concern, though, Cindy, the press has jumped on or throwing numbers around, and we realize it's a work in progress. But sometimes these numbers have a life of their own. And people are quoting them, and I've heard even at the Utilities Commission in regard 14 million, 20 million, all kinds of numbers. And I just want to take some care based upon what you're saying. A, it's a work in progress, and B, it can't be taken out of context. Okay. The last thing, because of Jim's absence, we normally ask him to give us a status of the various litigation and other matters involving Vero Electric. And so Wayne is going to give us a brief update and overview of what the situation is between the shores and the county, as well as other mediation and any questions, of course, that the commissioners have. Wayne.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And for Sherry's record, Wayne Kmet, City Attorney. Let's start with the recent Florida Supreme Court ruling. I'm sure y'all have seen that, where the New York County Commission's appeal to the Supreme Court. Basically, the court found for the city in both petitions, the PSC had basically rejected the county's petition as not proper. The Supreme Court upheld that. The other petition was by the city to ask the question that needed to be asked was, does the city have the right or the obligation to continue serving in the unincorporated area? PSC said yes. And the Supreme Court upheld that, saying that absolutely the PSC is the body that has that authority to determine the service territories based on their territorial orders. As far as any river shores, the actual lawsuit, it's been whittled down. The one that's in circuit court it's been whittled down to two main issues. That is, one is the whether or not the city's rates are reasonable. Obviously, we think they are in any matter of calculation through our rate experts. They're reasonable. And the other issue being when at the end of the current franchise agreement with Indian River Shores, is there some change in the use of any rights of way, thing like that? Keep in mind, there's very little that's actually apparently owned by. And rights of way are kind of an odd thing too. Anyway, there's few things that are outright owned by any city, even in this case with Indian River Shores. Typically, things are dedicated to the public, and so they're held in trust for the public by the local government. But anyway, our response there has been that obviously they're entitled to a calculated rate of return for either maintaining the properties that they have jurisdiction over, or basically some form of rent, which they've never charged through the form of a franchise fee, but which they could. So that right now is still in the discovery phase. We don't have a trial date yet set. That is the one, the civil lawsuit that when Jim and I, the city manager, and I met with the Shores city manager and their attorney, they had asked about delaying that to wait and see what happens with the PSC case, along with delaying the city's potential challenge to their ordinance number 520, where they try to regulate. They think they're going to regulate the city's rates and operations within the town. Jim and I are in agreement, and I think our attorneys are in agreement, that it's different issues. The lawsuit, the action in the Public Service Commission is not going to change anything in the lawsuit. It's different issues. The PSC action that they have now right now has to do with trying to reopen the territorial agreement that the city has, the territorial orders of the PSC, based on the territorial agreements between the City of Vero Beach and Florida Power and Light. And, of course, we've challenged that. The latest that we've heard is, and you may have also read this already, there is to be a Public Service Commission hearing in July. We do anticipate seeing then a staff report from the PSC staff probably towards the end of June. Until then, we really... The PSC itself typically, the commission typically takes seriously what the staff reports and what they recommend, so it's going to be interesting to see what the staff actually puts down on paper. Other than that, if there's anything specific, I don't know if you want to know about the diesel plant. That's because that's actually an electric system asset also. In that case, with BB redevelopment, it is scheduled for trial. I believe our first day of trial is supposed to be June 24th. And that's the issue. It's really just a landlord-tenant issue right now. They claim that the city misled them about the environmental conditions, and obviously we don't feel that's the case, and they should have been paying rent for some time now. Cindy will be a star witness about the amount of rent that's past due. But hopefully that's going to be resolved. And as you, I'm sure, know, we have a contract for selling the diesel plant property, which we're trying to clear all the possible clouds on the title because of these tenants, which needs to be done before we can actually go to closing.
Well, I have, I get somewhat fogged up when we're talking about the mediation, or going toward mediation, and that's with the Shores.
Well, that's the new issue where we basically, the council adopted a resolution saying that we've got a dispute, ordinance number 520, which has to do with them forming, the Indian River Shores Town Council formed itself as a utility commission, basically to be a rate-making body to oversee the rates and a lot of the operation side of the electric utility. But all kinds of restrictions and what have you that just aren't lawful, that are within their ordinance. So rather than just jump right into a lawsuit, the council agreed to go ahead and adopt a resolution saying that we've got this dispute and let's talk about it, invoking that Chapter 164 process where we get to sit down and talk about it. And that's the issue that they are talking about, maybe for staying any action even after the franchise agreement expires. Perhaps they won't try to enforce it and call the city in and for us to make a rate case. Basically give us an opportunity to challenge that before they actually try to do that. We have not heard back from their side on whether or not, I'm not sure if their council has even met yet to discuss that, to approve it. But once we do get that approval, we would be taking it to the city council here to make sure that our council's on board with the agreement to hold off, basically the city filing a lawsuit to challenge the ordinance. Until they want to hold off until the PSC issue is resolved. They also like I said, wanted to hold off on the civil suit in circuit court here. We think it's different issues, but we'll see how that goes.
Any other questions with the commissions? I have a couple, but commissioners have any? That was the shores. The other issue is that the council agreed, as I understand it, to meet with FMPA, OUC, FP.
Yeah, of course that's not litigation, but
I understand that. But
yeah, Chef is working on that. There's trying to coordinate all those different bodies, those representatives of all those different entities and their attorneys is a little difficult. There's several different dates under consideration right now, and the location of where it's going to be. There isn't any agreement yet. So, but that's something Chef Wright is definitely working on.
I guess I fail to see the advantage of that other than spending money, but okay.
Well,
I don't know what's going to accomplish.
Well, as I pointed out to the county attorney, I mean, he needs to closely read the letter that I'm sure y'all saw from Nick, the general manager there of FMPA. Nothing's changed. I mean, first thing is on the list, you need a qualified municipal utility to take over the city's contracts. And I point blank asked, who's the municipal utility you've got in mind to take over the contracts? And there was really no answer. So I don't know. I agree. I don't know what we're going to accomplish, but it's something in good faith we've agreed to do. To sit down and see if any of all these different parties has some ideas to how to make it work.
Well, I found it interesting that that's going to be a discussion of the full sale. At the same time, there is the other issue boiling in the background of a partial sale. So it really gets complex, and I can understand the public's frustration, and indeed our frustration, trying to understand all of these cross points that are coming up.
Yeah, whether or not the partial will come up, I don't know.
I'm just making a comment when it really has become almost quicksand trying to
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind. Of course, the press reports all these big numbers, 64.5 million, and the lowest number possible was around 46 million. And they kind of reported as, oh, well, that's the city's offer. But the city has never offered to sell for those numbers. It's just trying to point out to the other side, this is the impact on the city's ratepayers. And if FPL or any of Shores or anybody else wants to make another offer, they certainly can. But the last actual offer we heard was the $13 million. Yeah.
One advantage that I see is if FP&L is going to be included in this talk, wherever and whenever it's going to be. Okay, if they're included and FMPA is there and we're there and maybe the Shores are there, it does show an intent to the public that the city has not backed off its agreement to sell. And I think that's good.
And we could have canceled the contract, but we haven't. The contract's still in place, right?
That's right.
So, and that's got another year to run, right?
No, the end of this year.
End of this year.
This year, yeah. 16, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other point of confusion, perhaps, is that as I understand the order as was written, that when the franchise, if it expires with the county, it is essentially grandfathered in and continues, that we would collect the franchise fee?
Well,
that's my question.
There's an argument to be made that they've terminated it, effective. They've said they're not going to renew it. So maybe they need to let us know. Do they want us to collect the 6% or not? Because there's a difference between expiring, as happened in Winter Park. But remember, Winter Park had a option to buy the system back from the electric company there. And it expired, and the court there said, well, they're like a holdover tenant, so yes, you got to still keep collecting the franchise fee and remitting it to the electric company. Here, you've had them affirmatively come out and say, hey, we're not renewing. So that's a question. Does that cut off us having to collect the franchise fee? I don't know. It's something we'll have to work through. I would hope that before it actually expires with the county, they're going to, get with us and either come up with another franchise agreement or something, so we know what to do.
The agreement also left open some open-ended money questions that the county could charge or cross-charge. So there's a lot of open-ended issues
Absolutely.
in the deal, correct? The way I read it.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Keep in mind that it has for their franchise fee collection has zero impact on us. We collect it from the customers and we remit it to them. That's a pass-through. None of it sticks to us, so certainly that's there.
They have to have a franchise agreement to collect it, as I understand it, correct?
Part of that 6%, too, is not just for the use of the rights-of-way or whatever property they may have. It also includes, basically, in that franchise agreement says the city has the sole right to provide electric. Right. I mean, in theory, they could actually say, well, no longer do you have that sole right. We can have somebody else, too. So part of that 6% is for that privilege of having the sole right to provide electric. Of course, PSC orders come into play, too. So, again, I mean, it's things going to have to be worked through.
Well, it's not even clear they could get power from another source without coming through us.
Exactly.
Isn't that right?
They still have the PSC territorial issue to deal with.
Some of this is a sort of an intellectual twist, all of this.
It's quite an exercise. Yeah.
Right.
I don't see any, unless there's comments from the public, we appreciate what your input is, and
okay.
It just, I don't know whether it clarifies the issue, but it does give us the scope of what the complexity is. Thank you.
You're welcome.
With that, Cindy, and I know that our meeting has been delayed for some time, mainly because of some of the issues and difficulties in getting all of this data together, and I did not want to impose upon Cindy as she was trying to put together her CAFRA, as well as some of the other data that would be important that we're going to discuss today with not only the CAFRA but the fund balance and the rate sufficiency. So with that, Cindy, please.
And I'd like to say, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that as well. As many of you know, my assistant finance director left us a number of months ago, and as of Monday, my new comptroller is on board, so that will begin to help. But it has, and we're coming into budget season, so it's been a little tough on my short staff up there. So I appreciate a couple of extra weeks to provide all of this. So I guess the first thing we'll talk about is the second quarter variance analysis, budget versus actuals. You should have a report with the yellow cover, and as an accompaniment to that, you should have a variance analysis. I want to point out a couple of things in the report, which, as always, I won't spend a lot of time on this. There aren't any real variances that concern me, but certainly if, as you go through this in detail, you have any questions, you are always welcome to give me a call, and we can sit and we can talk about it. In the report itself, I would turn your attention, first of all, to page 15, which is a recap of the expenditures in the general fund by the type of expense that we've experienced, keeping in mind that this is through March 31st, which is 50% of the year. If you notice, in our general fund at this point, we are salaries and benefits, we've expended 50.1%. Operating expenses, 50.1%. The much smaller capital outlay is at about 56%, and the transfers are nearing 100%, mainly because the primary transfer is a debt service payment that happens one time a year. So that's all done. So essentially, through 50% of the year, we are at 51.7% of the total general fund expenditures, meaning we're pretty well right on the mark. And that is, I guess, always a concern. If you look, the other thing to point out in here is at page 32. One of the things I typically provide in these reports is a balance sheet for the electric utility, so we can talk about our cash position and our unrestricted cash. At this point, we're up a little bit from the first quarter of the year. We have a total cash balance of just about $30.7 million. And
excuse me, what page is that?
I'm sorry, page 32.
Oh, 32. Okay.
Page 32.
All right, okay.
Our unrestricted cash is about $21.5 million, and our unrestricted cash on hand as a number of days of working capital is at 104. It's up a little bit from our target of 90 for a couple of reasons, and it's part of the reason that our next item will be a recommendation of a reduction of our rates. That's essentially how we manage sort of the ebb and flow of our working capital, is as it starts to rise, we lower rates and then we bring it back down. And again, as we've talked about, and we'll talk about some more with the rates, we try to do that on a very steady trajectory and not wild swings in either direction. The other thing, though, and Mr. O'Connor and I have discussed this, given some of the uncertainties facing us at this moment as we begin to dismantle some of the tanks on the site and do some of that work there and not knowing exactly how much some of those things are going to cost, we both feel very comfortable that 104 days of cash on hand is really not particularly overkill when you consider that it wouldn't go down by that much if we brought it back to 90. And finally, as we've discussed on many occasions, 90 is an absolute minimum. That is a minimum as far as bond agencies are concerned, not necessarily a great target, but something that you really shouldn't dip below as opposed to something you shouldn't go above. So having said that, the rest of the funds are, we provide on revenues and expenses both these graphical looks at where we stand year to date for total revenue and total expenses versus the pro rata of 50%. And I don't really see much of anything in here at the fund level that is much of a variance from the budgets that we adopted, with the exception of some electric utility expenses, and I'd like to talk about those when we talk about the variance analysis. So before we move to the variance analysis, does anyone have any items in here they'd like to ask a question about?
I do. If we go to page 8, which is the cash investments balanced by funds, and look at the at some of the funds. For example, the Marina Fund. Mm-hmm. Which is, $418, and has over $300,000 debt payment each year.
What happens with the Marina Fund, and you'll see this every year, the debt service payment for the Marina is due on October the 1st. And so what typically happens with our Marina is at about September the 30th, because of, and we'll look at this in the CAFR a little bit more detail when we get to the CAFR. On September 30th, it typically has enough cash on hand to make that debt service payment that comes due the following day. It makes that debt service payment and now spends the next 12 months, if you will, sort of climbing back out of that hole until September 30th comes and it has enough money to make its debt service payment. One of the things that but that doesn't, and again we'll look at it in the CAFR, doesn't bode well for the unrestricted net assets when you consider it also has assets that are currently depreciating. What Council's asked us to do, the city manager and I, in this year's budget, is propose to them a way that we might be able to begin to help the Marina with that burden by either providing it with some funding for capital improvements, which it doesn't really have, or by figuring out a way to distribute the debt service payments to other funds. And so that's something that we'll be looking at this year.
Well, and I'm just going through that again. The cemetery also has been running, in this case, a deficit.
Slowly improving one.
What?
A slowly improving one. And if you look at the CAFRs year over year, we've gone from 100 plus of a deficit to about 90 of a deficit. This particular fiscal year, this is month ending March. We had a very, very large sale in April that is going to improve this position tremendously. And we are making, finally, at this point, transfers from the general fund to the cemetery, acknowledging that the cemetery isn't quite, making enough revenue to cover its operating expenditures. So the deficit is improving, but it is still there, and it may take a number of years between the transfer from from the general fund, along with just, kind of improving results over there to get back to where we need to be. We have not had a lot of success with columbarium sales. We've tried repricing, we've tried marketing, and for whatever reason, that's the place where we're just not. And you can see that, I think, in the report here, we're just not having a lot of success with those sales. So,
can we go back to the Marina Fund just a second? I'm glad you raised that issue on Marina, Peter. I just want to make sure I understand this figure and what it stands for. On page 54, cash carryover. Negative 42,880. I'll let you get to that page.
In these funds, and it's counterintuitive, but a negative cash carryover is a good thing. A negative cash carryover is actually a increase to the fund balance. A positive cash carryover means you're using up fund balance as a revenue source, and a negative cash carryover means you have extra. So the way the Marina's been budgeted on a cash basis is after it pays its debt service in this particular fiscal year, it should have an extra $42,000.
Okay, so the Marina Fund did not lose money then last year.
Well, this is 15-16's budget. So far, it's tracking along pretty well to that budget. But this is the current year. When we go to the CAFR, we'll look at what happened with the Marina last year. But this is 15-16. So this is through month-end March. And through month-end March, our prediction was it would be ahead by about $43,000. And through month-end March, we have revenues that are along about 50% of the budget and expenditures that are only 37%. So we're doing pretty well in the Marina year to date.
While we're talking about the Marina, though, when I looked at it, and I know we got a capital shortage problem there, but it's a very valuable asset, to the city. And with interest rates as low as they are, the question comes up, why don't we refinance that thing and extend out the terms and get the cash flow to work and support its own capital expenditures? I ran the numbers, and it looked to me like we could do that.
Unfortunately, we've looked at that, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll double check, that 2007A debt is one of the ones that doesn't have a call provision in it without a penalty. That's essentially a make-whole penalty.
Is penalty that severe that we couldn't look?
There'd be a point at which we can call it, but it's not now. So, our financial advisor keeps a good eye on when those refi dates come along.
There's some spread there we could use in terms of cash flow to the
unfortunately, when you have the debt with make-whole provisions, if you refinance it, you don't win because essentially you're going to pay the interest they would have. Yeah. So that one I don't believe is available to be refinanced at this point because Craig Dunlap and I had a look at that a year or so ago. So certainly if and when we can, we will. But again, to just extend the debt kind of, kicks it down the road a little bit anyway. The ideas that council had proffered were either one, somebody else help support some of that debt service as in another fund, obviously the general fund because it's not related to any of the utilities, or maybe the 1 cent sales tax fund that does all the capital improvements everywhere else does capital improvements for the Marina as well and donates them to the Marina. We'll just have to have a look at the numbers.
With the revenues of the Marina being ratable at 50% through the year, do we actually collect as much revenue in the second half of that year as the first? Or is it more seasonal?
It's seasonal, but we actually do pretty well in the summer. Again, if we can just hold a little of this till the CAFR, I can show you in the CAFR from the cash flow statement. Essentially what the Marina is doing right now is it's doing really well and it's making enough cash to cover its debt service payment, but not much extra. You know,
That's the problem.
so if it had nothing but the debt service payment, it's essentially kind of in a break-even situation. But as you know, it also has a bunch of capital assets that are depreciating, and when you put that depreciation expense on those assets, unless you are investing in capital at that same rate, it's going the other direction. And we don't have enough left over in cash every year to actually make those capital investments. And so we had some of the problems we had recently with complaints about the quality of facilities, but we don't really have the cash available to do it. And so that's kind of what we're struggling with.
And it distributes back to the general fund about $90,000 a year, I think, roughly.
It is. But again, that's like every other enterprise fund. And unless you're doing a 6% return on revenue to the general fund, then that's kind of negates the point of having enterprise funds. The thing that happened, and when I first came on board, I was meeting a little bit regularly with the Marine Commission to talk about this, is that when the city first borrowed the piece of property that the borrowing is for, bought the property that the borrowing is for, they had a grant from the Florida Inland Navigation District. And that grant paid the debt service payment for the first 3 years, I believe, and then went away. So everything was fine for the first 3 years, but after the grant went away, the marina, in a time when it was in a bit of a downturn because of the economy, was suddenly saddled with the entire $300,000+ debt service payment, and that's when the whole thing kind of
Sounds like Social Security or something.
Kind of got mashed.
Yeah.
Is the marina operating at capacity or near peak capacity?
It is. It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the rates are comparable to?
Tim has gone through a couple of times in the last couple. He raised the rates. I think it was last year or year before. He's done surveys of other marinas. I will tell you, he has dialed back his staffing. He's trying to control his side of the equation, the operating costs, to the point where I think he's actually probably gone a little too far. I think he lives there. He's got himself and one other full-time person, and right now the occupancy and the traffic through that marina for even simple things like gas is tremendously high. So, it's all part of a task we've been assigned for this year's budget to try to figure out how to make that all work and keep the marina the quality resource that it is, but figure out a way to make the finances work.
Okay. From what I know, it is a good public relations asset for Vero Beach.
And returns revenue, as Mr. Brevant pointed out, returns $90,000 to $100,000 worth of revenue to the general fund as well every year. So it's certainly an asset worth holding on to.
You mentioned that we can't call the debt. When does it mature?
It matures in 20. It's pretty far out, like 27.
Oh.
It's in the CAFR. So I can get an exact answer for you. But yeah, so it's a while. And again, I apologize for not knowing what the call date is. I just know that at this point, that's not an option for us. It matures in October of 2027.
That's a far-off.
As we look at that for this summer's budget, we'll put together some information and share it with you about what our possibilities are for refinancing and when that might be. Yeah, okay. As part of the conversation.
I think essentially on the variance. Any other questions on the variance, or you want?
I actually had two things I wanted to point out on the variance analysis, if I could. So this is this document, and the first one is on page 1. Essentially, as we've talked about before, almost all of these variances are labeled variance within normal parameters. They are things that we absolutely expect at this point in the year, so they wouldn't really cause a budget amendment as far as I can see at the end of the year. The first one that I've seen so far this year in the general fund that we are going to continue to monitor that may end up being over budget is the police overtime, which is down there toward the bottom of the page, the first thing under general fund expenditures. Just want to point out that essentially they've had some additional airport security details for the new airline service, and they also have had some cases this year that required a fair amount of overtime. Just, that's something they can't predict. So that's one we'll keep an eye on. And the airport overtime actually is going to be trued up at the end of the year, and the airport is on a, by resolution has to pay for whatever services it gets. So that'll be part of a year-end true-up, but the overtime for the caseload may end up resulting in a budget amendment. The other thing is on page 2, as you get down toward the bottom of the page there, under electric fund expenditures, those first two items, maintenance salaries for distribution and maintenance salaries that are well under budget, are essentially due to the closure of the plant and the early retirement and or departure of a number of the people in power resources. So even though that looks like a big variance, that's certainly something we expected as we close the plant, along with some of these other expenditures in the electric utility that are under budget. Other than that, unless anyone has any specific questions, we'll keep moving. And I'm always happy to answer questions later.
I'm just saying that it looks like we're really on a good path this year in terms
Really
of
on
where
target.
we are.
Yep, I believe that we are,
We're-
particularly in the general fund.
It is hard to find anything, but on page 1 with the Recreation Department. Was it
One of the
closed for a
variants or
while?
one of the,
I'm sorry, in here.
on this one? Okay.
Was the Recreation Department closed for part of some time there?
Yeah, their income is so seasonal. I mean, a huge percentage it comes in the summer months. And we also have just, in the last few years, as their operation has changed, they have not made the revenues in the last couple of years they did 5 years ago. So this is one where, on the whole, I would see them coming up to at least 75 or 80% of this. That's how much their summer income outdoes their winter income. And on the whole, it's not huge. I don't think it'll have a major impact to the bottom line, but it's certainly, when we look at this year's budgeted numbers, what we've been doing each year is budgeting 3-year average for the last 3 years of actuals. And that may start to continue to go down a little bit.
Cindy, what's the source of our bad debts?
Which ones?
The one here on page 3, where it's the $240,000 budget. It's around the middle of the page.
Those are primarily the utilities, electric, water and sewer, and solid waste for our utility billings. We have an annual process where we write off the bad debt as well as make an allowance for uncollectibles. And the difference between last year's allowance for uncollectibles and this year's goes to bad debt as well. So.
Are deposits not sufficient to cover?
They tend to be, but, not a lot of times with commercial. We also have a policy that, we return deposits if you have timely payment for a certain period of time. I believe it's 6 months to a year, then you get your deposit back. A lot of our bad debt write-offs for the last few years, and they're pretty much gone, have been due to the hurricanes. I mean, during that 2004, 2005 timeframe, we had a lot of difficulties in collection. So all in all, our total allowance for uncollectible in the electric utility is at $3 million. So I think, what is it, around 3% of total revenue? It's really not a bad number. But that was based on, the 240 was based on an average of the last 3 years. I don't think it's going to be that high because we're at the 8-10 year mark. We finally worked off all those hurricanes. So
it looks like there will be quite a bit of reallocation from the gas and oil expenditures and all funds. Do we do that, or is there time you decide to do that? Or? Well,
there actually really isn't that much. All of the gas and oil accounts across all the funds come to $623,000 citywide. If you take where we were through the month of April and multiply it by 2, or multiply it out so it's prorated, we would have about $260,000 left over citywide, right. And that would equate in the general fund. The biggest impact would be about $87,000, and that's assuming nothing happens to gas prices over the summer. So it's really not that big of a number. So not in the scheme of a $20 million budget.
So it runs through the end of the year, and then we work on next year's budget.
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing too is that if, for instance, the gas and oil in the general fund comes in under by $80,000, which is not that big of a number compared to the total budget, it may well be that the police overtime comes over by $80,000. Okay. So when you get at that level, I feel good about the bottom line at this point. Yeah. Anything else? Moving on? Okay. As I said, if you find anything as you're going through this, or just want to talk about these reports, I'm always happy to do that. Just give me a call. So the next thing that you have is a quarterly electric utility rate sufficiency analysis. We did not do one the first quarter of this year as we normally do, because we have been in a place where we've been simultaneously working on the revised purchase power contract with OUC, the completion of the rate study, the closure of the plant, quite a number of things that are sort of works in progress. And so, waiting for the dust to settle, we ran the first quarter, and now this is my second quarter rate sufficiency, done the way I normally do it, comparing original projections to the actuals through month-end March, but with a couple of changes. So if you would look at the second page, that looks like this. It's a summary of all the revenues and expenses in the electric utility. And I don't know if you printed it in color, but should have a couple of numbers that are bolded on it. So essentially, this is the bottom line, and the places where there are numbers in here that are different from the original budget are as follows. The first one, at the very top, is power resources. You know, the original budget for power resources was $3 million plus. This number reflects a revised budget that's also been provided to the rate consultant based on Ted's estimate of what he will actually spend through the end of the year with the reductions in staffing that we saw in the variance analysis and all the other lowered costs that we have as a result of partial plant closure for part of the year. So in completing this rate sufficiency through year end, I've used numbers that reflect the closure of the power plant as we understand it today. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second number, the purchase power, is actually the number that was provided by Mr. Wright and Bill Harrington based on the revised OUC contracts that we negotiated in November. So again, I'm doing a rate sufficiency predicated on the purchase power costs that have been projected based on the new OUC contract, not on the old information. So that's very up to date as well. The next 3 or 4 budgets, customer service, T&D, electric system design, those are all the original budgets because nothing has really changed in those operations for this year. Coming down a little bit to debt service and the transfer to the R&R fund. That transfer to the R&R fund, or the capital fund 403, also reflects the amount of money that would be required to support the revised capital program that Ted's consultants who have done the rate, optimization, or the utility optimization study have recommended. That is actually an increase of $1 million from the $4 million that was originally budgeted, but that is the level that the rate consultants and I feel is appropriate for this year to support a kind of a level set of transfers across the next few years to accomplish the projects that have been suggested by the optimization consultant. So the rest of this is my normal rate sufficiency. I've got actuals through March of 2016 for revenue, and then 6 months worth of projections at the current rates. And the rest of this is as budgeted or as projected. But the 3 things that are different, that are as up to date as we can make them, is the power resources cost with the partial closure of the plant, the updated purchase power costs based on the new OUC contract, and the updated required transfer to the capital program based on the latest information from the utility optimization consultants. So this is as accurate, I feel, as we can make it at this point in time.
And the bottom line is that the revenue surplus goes up $900,000
from what we originally projected, which was $1 million, and comes to almost $2 million.
Right.
Now, again, I always have to point this out because you see $2 million, you're like, well, $2 million, but in the context of the entire electric utility revenues, that is 2%. So that's not, a huge number. However, it is certainly a number that we feel like, given our trajectory to year end, the rate consultants and I now are working together on this. They've seen all this information. All of this information for 15-16, as well as that new capital plan, has been folded into their 5-year rate projection that you'll see in a month or so as part of the utility rate study, and they feel comfortable with the recommendation I'm about to make as well. What the city manager and I have kind of always had as our goal is sustainable rates that go down or even up if they have to, on a trajectory that makes sense. In other words, we don't do a decrease of 10 and then an increase of 9 and then a decrease of 12. We like to see rate stability. And so what we're recommending here is a rate decrease that we feel comfortable, and so does our rate consultant, that we can sustain, and that is appropriate in the context of what you'll see in a few months in the rate study itself, in the more detailed 5-year rate study. Okay. Having said that, what we're recommending based on that is a decrease from $65.15 per 1,000 kilowatt hour for the purchase power cost, the bulk power cost, to $63.15. So it's a $2 decrease, which is about 1.7% on a typical 1,000 kilowatt hour residential bill. Right now, a 1,000 kilowatt hour residential bill is $119.58, and this would take it down to $117.58. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or discuss this with you.
What action are you looking from us? Okay.
This would go to council at the next meeting with the recommendation that we lower these rates from from 65.15 to 63.15, the $2 pending the completion of the rate study scheduled for later this summer. I think the action you've taken in the past with regard to these recommended rate decreases has been to either, what's the word I'm looking for, support the staff recommendation or not.
Any comments from commissioners?
I think it's reasonable.
Anyone wants to make a motion and
Mr.
support the staff?
I'm alternate. Can I make a motion?
I tried.
I move that we support the rate reduction.
Any comments?
Second.
Second. Either one of us.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. For what it's worth.
I just want to just point out on this chart, our resources, even though it was reduced from $1 million on the first top line to 2.4, as the ongoing review is going to come up, next year there isn't going to be any power resources, it seems to me. So that number should plunge close to zero, which again
Which it actually doesn't, though. One thing to keep in mind, and I just want to lower everyone's expectation a little on that, what we showed you when we showed you the first version of the rate study, I believe, and the OUC costs, there are some residual pension costs within the power resources group that cannot go away that are about $400,000+, and there are several people that will not actually go away. They will be absorbed into other departments. So the residual cost, I believe, was right around $800,000 or so for power resources. I can double check that, but so it won't go completely away.
As I said, it's a work in progress. So that's just another issue as we go into the budget season and the recommendations are made. That except there's going to be whatever that reduction is, it's more than zero. And it's going to increase the cash flow. And hopefully, given what Mr. Clement made mention today, that the $1 million that we're paying in litigation, in professional fees, could also be impact downward if we're satisfactory completion, whatever it is, in our favor regarding this litigation. So there are some positive notes. There's also the whole issue about we haven't discussed it, the potential sale of not only the power plant, the old power plant, the diesel plant, but also Dodgertown, which is up for sale, which is all in the works. Nothing's clear, but there are some things on the horizon that could be helpful in terms of what we're going to discuss, which is the next issue, I think.
Cindy, isn't this our third or fourth reduction in the last couple of years? We've been consistently going down a little bit. It's just the third or fourth one. I think it's the fourth one.
It is. Actually, we have been going down. I have a list of all the rates since going back to like 2005. We have been going downward since November the 1st of 2013 when it was at 130.93. Right. We lowered it to 129.43, 123.93, 122.08 in September of last year, 119.58 in December of last year, and now the 117.58.
So about our sixth reduction over the last couple of years, which is pretty darn positive.
About almost $13.5 since November of 2013.
It's close to 10% if you add it all up in my head, correct? Mm-hmm. Roughly.
It is.
That's still pretty healthy.
And with potential of even more improvements as we go forward.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, certainly, our goal has been in the last couple of years that as we still continue to try completion of the sale, that we treat, as we've talked about this in many meetings and with Mr. O'Connor, we treat this utility as a going concern. We treat our, working capital and fund balances as would be appropriate for a going concern, but that we also strive toward optimization and lowering costs and keeping our rates as reasonable as possible, which is all we can do in the absence of a sale. So that's certainly been our effort.
Any other comments from the commissioners?
Next. So next, what we have is a conversation about your final recommendation, hopefully to council, regarding a fund balance policy for the general fund. So I just want to recap a couple of things and cover a couple of things real quickly to make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll turn it over to you for some discussion and recommendations. First of all, council has asked about this. At the last council meeting, the question was, when will they see this? Based on conversations we had last year, it's been their goal to adopt one before they start this year's budget activity, and I indicated to them that you had been discussing it extensively and that you had a final version in front of you for this meeting, and that my plan was to bring it back before them in June with a recommendation from you so that they could adopt it, or at least adopt it in theory before they begin their budget workshops in July. What you have here is a final version with changes from our prior discussion. And let me just recap kind of what I think are the most important points about this policy as it stands. And it should be under a cover memo that says General Fund Balance Policy Recommendation to City Council. I want to make sure those guys have what we're looking at. So the first most important part of this is to remember that this is about the fund balance in the general fund only. This is not about the enterprise funds. They all have different targets. They have different externally imposed conditions by debt covenants and bond rating agencies. So the first thing about this policy is it is about the general fund only. The second thing that's key in this policy, as we've discussed before, is that fund balance is not a recurring revenue source that grows indefinitely. And so a very central feature of this proposed policy is that fund balance can only be used for one-time expenditures, things like capital or special projects, and not plugged into the budget to cover recurring operating expenditures. The third thing about this policy, as we've looked at it in the past, is it's got a layered approach, and there's actually three kinds of set-asides, if you will, for different specific things: emergency reserves, budget stabilization layer, and then working capital, which is just the money that covers us for those 3 months at the end of the fiscal year when we haven't gotten our taxes in yet, and we have to still make payroll and pay our vendors. There have been a couple of modifications to this policy based on our conversation. In Section 6 on the second page, where it talks about the allowable uses of excess fund balances, in the second paragraph, where it says, unless otherwise prohibited by law, appropriate uses of excess fund balance, and the thing in parentheses where it says, as determined under Section 5, was added at your request. Down under Section 8, where it talks about minimum reserves and replenishing the fund balance targets, the last sentence in that first paragraph where it says replenishment of the emergency disaster reserve will be the highest priority in restoration of fund balance components to target levels. That was added, I think, Mr. Brevant, at your request, that we make it clear that emergency reserves are the most important thing to put back. And then finally, the second paragraph of that section, it says if, and then there's a comma, as a result of unforeseen budgetary needs. I added that after our last discussion to make it clear that the budget stabilization reserve wasn't there just to use, but to be used in the event of unforeseen budgetary challenges. And so with that, the last thing I think we need to talk about is how they adopt this. When we talked about this last, you made a motion and a vote to adopt it by ordinance. And I went to the city attorney and discussed it with him, and he pointed out a couple of things. And the first one was that typically ordinances are directed by council. So in other words, when there's something that they'd like to adopt by ordinance, the city council will say to the city attorney, please take this and draft it up for us in the form of an ordinance. Part of the reason that's done is because if it comes to the council as an ordinance, it has to be advertised properly. There's costs associated with it. There's costs associated with codification. So normally we don't undertake that unless we've already received some direction from council saying, yes, we want an ordinance. But the other more important issue that Wayne pointed out, and this comes back to, you should all have a copy of this email in front of you. You know, as Wayne pointed out, typically ordinances are restricted to being official legislative actions that are really local laws. They're permanent in nature. They're enforceable as local laws, meaning that within the city's code, there are penalties for not monetary penalties in many cases for not complying with those things that are ordinances and then codified as part of the city code. Whereas typically resolutions are more what you use when the governing body wants to express their intent for some matter of administration or provide for the disposition of something that's really administrative business and not a law. And so Wayne's suggestion was that something relative to fund balance policy that may well be a work in progress as we try it and then tweak it. We've written this as well as we can, but you could still probably look at any one of these paragraphs and interpret it about 10 ways. That's just the nature of the beast. Might be better as a resolution so that it could be a bit more flexible as we find out that maybe we said something that we didn't really work out the way we thought it was going to. So certainly it's up to you, and we can talk about that, but Wayne suggested you might consider recommending that it be adopted by resolution rather than ordinance, unless you feel very strongly about the ordinance for those reasons. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'd give it back to you for discussion and recommendation.
Well, what seems to me, for the reasons you stated, the resolution, it makes a lot more sense than codifying it into law. But having said all that, what is the impact of this, if we make this resolution, on the $9.8 million that we have now in the fund, or whatever that number is?
If we use this policy,
right,
and we make the calculation that is prescribed in Section 5 for determination of excess fund balance, if we use last year's audited funds, this year's 15-16 adopted budget, the excess fund balance, if you will, would be about $134,000. So $133,402. So that would be money that then when we come into the budget season this summer, we would say, by the way, you've got your, let's say, here's a perfect example because I can tell you this is an area we're going to have some decisions to make this summer. Here's your 1 cent sales tax fund. Here's your capital projects. And by the way, in addition to your 1 cent sales tax fund, you have another $134,000 that you could use on some projects. Or you can leave it.
Right.
Your call.
Right. And that's at the option of the...
And that would be at the option of council. So again, that's in Section 5. It says they can appropriate it for expenditure. They could also appropriate it for expenditure in 15-16. When we go to them and say, you have this extra $134,000, they could say, great, we don't want to wait till 16-17. We'd like to pick a project to do it right now. Let's take that $134 and do, I don't know, just something at Leisure Square, or just something that, you know,
or the marina.
A stormwater project, or exactly. That is exactly what they could do. And that's, you know, another great consideration. One-time capital projects at the marina would be a perfect expense, a perfect use of these fund balance funds. And there's a great need that's been identified recently, and they could simply appropriate it beginning right now, take that $134 and spend it in the marina.
I do recall we spoke about this in great detail when it was brought up, and you've made the changes that were recommended. We do have some new members who were not a part of that, but you know, if those changes were made, I think it must, you know, meet the expectations, because I do recall we had extensive conversation about it. So.
And I think I made all the changes that we ultimately decided we wanted to. The concern about them just dipping into budget stabilization, we clarified with that one statement Mr. Brevant's concern that there was not enough clarity in the fact that if fund balances dip below target levels, the first thing that needed to be put back was emergency reserves, et cetera. So, you know, I think this is an extremely good policy. You know, sometimes, I mean, it could be 20 pages, but I think the two that we have here really convey what we're after. They make the important points clear, which is the things I talked about earlier, I think this makes it very clear that you can't take those excess fund balances, if you will, and then say, oh, we'll just plug it into the budget next year and cover salaries with it. Down that path lies madness. And it gives you, as you just pointed out, wow, now we have this excess money within reasonable boundaries that we can take and apply to a problem that we've identified right now and solve that problem and then move on. So, you know, council certainly can change the levels, whatever they like, but I think this gives them a great framework. You know, whether it's a resolution or an ordinance, and I think we had this conversation last time, an ordinance can be changed. It just takes 2 readings. And so this city council has expressed their intent to have a fund balance policy and to live within it. And certainly that is the most important part. So providing this framework is no matter which way you do it, it's something that their commitment to that has to be there, and they've expressed it. And even if it was an ordinance and a future council wanted to not do it this way, you can't bind them to not change an ordinance. So
I think as Jim pointed out in our discussion, I did compare this new one against the old one word for word, and I think this is an improvement. So I don't see any problem with this, the way we've got it written. And I think Jim made a point I thought that was valid. It's more for a staff guide. Now when they budget, they know they can't go back to the city council asking for more money. That doesn't. So it's more of a guide for staff, I thought, and that's what he thought too.
So what I hear you saying is it's a very clear guide for you.
I believe it is. I mean, when I drafted it the first time, I looked at lots and lots of other people's policies, and kind of incorporated the best, what I thought were the best bits of those. And certainly it is consistent with the guidance that we were given by the Government Finance Officers Association in terms of what belongs in a policy and what's important to state clearly. Nothing's perfect, so I think this is very good, and I think we recommend it to council at your pleasure, and then work with it this summer during budget season and see if it meets our needs.
And I think the concern was we had no policy, and our concern was maybe the fund balance would be used indiscriminately. Well, without a policy, that would be more of an event that could happen. So I think, the policy is certainly a good one, and as a resolution can be changed. It's not written in stone, but can be changed if we find it's needed. So.
If we find that some way that it's worded is not working for us, to good or to bad. I agree. Well, and you're right. You're perfectly right. There was no policy to this point in time, so this would be one. And last summer, when the whole discussion of plugging in fund balance for operating expenditures came up, the council at that time said, okay, we're not going to do this, but we expect that we will have a policy before we begin our deliberations next summer so that we have some guidance as to how we proceed.
I guess where I'm coming from on the resolution, pass the resolution and then have it in effect for some time, and then if you want to convert it to an ordinance because you've tweaked it, then it seems to me to make sense. But comments?
That's an excellent point.
What is our fund balance now? About $9 million?
Our unrestricted fund balance.
I got 8, I think.
Back to the CAFR. Hang on a second.
Approximately. I'm not off by much.
9.8, I think.
Pardon me?
I believe it's like 9.8.
Oh, more than 9 million. Okay.
9.9. Yeah.
Well, okay. Can I ask you a question then, Cindy? Over the course of the last 10 years, have you ever seen any unnecessary or reckless use of that fund balance by council in coming up with the budget?
I
last 10 years.
I've been here for 5.
Okay.
I have not seen in the historical data that I put together, the fund balance has gone down in as many years as it's gone up, but typically it was not as part of the original adopted budget, but as a consequence of things that happened during the year. There was one year where there was an appropriation of fund balance, and it was about 9 years ago, and if I recall, when I looked at it, it had something to do with those hurricanes. So there was a period of time where there were some ups and downs due to the hurricanes, but
and last year it was used a little bit, wasn't it?
No.
It was not used last year?
Last year's budget was the revenues were greater than the expenses.
Okay. So we didn't raise the millage last year.
We did raise the millage last year.
Raise the millage, okay.
Yeah. But Dan, if you recall, last year, some of us, it did come up in the budget that they wanted to tap into the funds.
Right.
And it was allocated,
right.
Like it or not, it was allocated for fixed expenses.
I recall
But after
that.
discussion about it, they shut it down.
It was pulled back out.
And pulled the 450 CapEx out, too, to make everything work. So there was a potential to use it
Okay, that's
incorrectly.
fine. And they made a decision without a fund balance policy, whatever you're going to call this. They made a decision not to go into the reserves.
But it took
Doesn't that belie the argument that we need a fund balance policy?
No, because
they
made
didn't do it.
because they made the decision with the stated we're not going to do it this year, but we want a fund balance policy before next year. So and they actually backed away from it, and I think you can elaborate on this, but the reason they backed away from it was they said we would like to wait until we have a policy before we do anything with fund balance. So that's the reason we're having this conversation. This was not brought forward by staff. This was directed by council.
I'm not saying this, but to me it makes it easier for the city council to raise the millage rather than give them unfettered discretion. So we can't go into that $9.5 million budget. We can't do it because of these policies. Therefore, we have to raise the millage. That's why I don't think it's a good
cut the expenses.
What's the likelihood of that with this council?
But I think and again, that's a valid concern. If it's your concern, I think what the city manager and I had expressed with regard to that was nothing that you adopt can restrict this council's ability to set budgets and millage rates as they see fit. So certainly this is a suggestion and a policy, but there's nothing that can preclude the council's prerogatives under Florida statute to set millage rates as they see fit or to appropriate funds as they see fit. So you got to keep that in mind.
Unless they make it an ordinance, is that correct? And then they'd have to change the ordinance.
Yes, okay. But again, this provides for the fact that there may be cases when, as a result of unforeseen budgetary needs, the fund balance goes down and is later replenished. So again, there's no part of local ordinance that can be adopted that takes away the city council's rights under Florida statutes to establish millage rates. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
So again, they've asked for the guidance. They've asked for the policy. They've governed themselves accordingly in the absence of one and said, hey, we don't want to do anything with fund balance, so we have some sort of a policy, but nothing that we do here today can change their charter, if you will, as elected officials under Florida municipal laws.
And I think it's helpful, too, for new members of the city council to have the ordinance, to have the resolution in place. It's an educational tool. You don't, you can read it and know, okay, now this is how we're going to operate. So I think it's very positive. I think we should move ahead.
Now, does the resolution have an indefinite life, or
unless it specifically has some sort of a expiration date or a sunset in it, it has an indefinite life until it's superseded by something else.
They can change it.
So as you have changing councils and new members, they would have this directive, where maybe they would have a different mindset. So it's good maybe to have it in there.
I'll move that we accept the fund balance policy as a resolution versus an ordinance.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. I think that our commission, in focusing on this issue and others, excuse me, are indeed making a contribution to give not only the staff but recommendations as we are charted.
Absolutely. This is good work, and I think they'll be extremely appreciative of the time that you've put into it. And also, having an adopted fund balance policy is something that is very much regarded as a best practice for local government finance by the Government Finance Officers Association. So, a lot of people talk about doing it, but actually doing it is something that not most governments, have a hard time getting to. So I really appreciate your help in doing this. We'll work with it, and we'll see how it goes. With this recommendation from you, what I'll do, with your permission, is work with the city attorney so that when this goes to the council on the agenda, it's under a resolution. In other words, he and I can do a resolution without having to wait because we don't have to advertise it and all that. So we'll make it a resolution, put it on the agenda as being recommended by staff and the Finance Commission, and then take it from there.
We'll also, I presume, with auditors, whomever they may be, would look favorably on having such a policy as part of a guidance, as opposed to just, as it was written, completely at the discretion. So,
who actually looks favorably on fund balance policies? Bond rating agencies. If you look at some of the articles that say Fitch and Moody's have on best practices for municipal governments, having fund balance policies is on their list. So they view that as a piece of fiscal responsibility they like to see in people when they rate bonds. So that's another one.
I think that's as compelling as anything else. But all right, thank you, Cindy, and thank you, commissioners, for the work that we've done.
So, our last
now the CAFRA.
Not our last thing, but not our least thing. Does everyone have a copy of this, or one that they can share with other people? Because if not, this was actually given to everyone back when it was produced a month or so ago, not just as part of this agenda. So if you did not get one for some reason and you want one, or you got one and your friends were so envious that you gave it away to them and you need another one, just let me know and I'll make sure that you have a copy of this, because this is one of the most important documents that you can have as a Finance Commission member, in my opinion, in terms of the city's finances. So in the meantime, if you don't have one, if you could share with the person next to you, that would be great. So the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, this is for the fiscal year that ended last September 30th. And the number one thing to point out, I think, is that this is what we like to call a clean audit. Our auditors have determined that this is a fair presentation of our financial position, that there are no material weaknesses in our internal controls. There was one instance of noncompliance on the federal single audit that they noted that did not modify their opinion that we don't have any material weaknesses, but there was an issue with the way federal state single audits are specialty audits for the grants that we have that are required by federal law, and they did find a situation where we have professional services vendors who work on grants, just like we have construction contractors who work on grants. Our construction contracts all contain affidavits from these construction contractors that say they're not on the federal restricted bid list, they haven't committed criminal acts, et cetera. There's a certification form. We, for whatever reason, did not realize that there was an expectation we would do the same thing for our professional services, like our engineering and people like that. So it is a requirement. They've noted that. We've added it to our procurement procedures, and it's kind of a small issue, but it's an issue they noted in there. And we had no management letter comments, which we had one last year regarding our rework of fixed assets. We had no comments this year. So very, very clean audit. What we had instead for fun were two kind of major items that changed the way we present our financial statements. The first one, and let's look at page 106. We might skip around a little bit if that's okay with everyone. This gets mentioned in the cover memo, but we'll skip right to where the numbers get talked about. On the left-hand side there under restatements, down at the bottom, change in fund accounting, recreation enterprise fund eliminated. So as you recall, partly on your recommendation and the concurrence of the Recreation Commission, we got rid of the recreation as an enterprise fund, and we folded it back into the general fund for the 14-15 budget. And so in this particular audited financial statement, it was actually a restatement of the position at the beginning of the year at October 1, 2014. So that's the first thing that happened. So if you hold up the 14 CAFR next to the 14-15 CAFR, all that stuff about recreation as an enterprise fund is gone from those proprietary fund financial statements, and it's just another department in the general fund. And as you can see, there's some assets that got moved, cash that got moved, and some liabilities that got moved, and now it's all just part of the general fund. The bigger impact was the new pronouncement on pensions. I'd like to go very Reader's Digest version on this one, take you back to the very top level financial statement, show you what it means, talk a little bit about the impact it has on us, and then leave the rest for anybody who really is interested to dive down a bit deeper into this. But this is kind of a big deal, so if you could indulge me for a second, we'll talk about it, and you can ask questions if you have those questions. So I want you to go to, let's stay at the high level. Go to page... Sorry, I should have tagged this one. Page 32. So here's kind of the Reader's Digest explanation of this change in accounting principle. Up until this year, the city has a defined benefit pension plan, you all know. And that defined benefit pension plan has unfunded liabilities. And up to this point in time, the city's actuary every year does an actuarial valuation and, based on many factors, gives us a recommended amount of money that we're supposed to put into that pension fund every year to not only pay the current benefits, but to amortize and pay down that unfunded liability so that within a set amount of time, our pension plan would be 100% funded. And that's the way that we've done it by Florida law for years. And so as a result, on our financial statements, the only time we would have been required to show a pension liability on our financial statements is if we did not make the entire payment that the actuary told us to make. So if, for instance, the actuary said, you need to put in $5 million on your pension plan this year, and again, I'm going to talk about these numbers, they're big ones, but they're citywide, all funds, and it's $4.5 million in this past year, and we only put in $2 million, then we would have been required to show a $2 million accumulated liability on the books. However, we're in Florida, and there's something a little special about Florida that's different from many other states. The Florida law requires us to make our actuarially required contribution to the pension plan. Unlike states like, I believe, Indiana and other places where they're allowed to decide whether they feel like making the entire contribution that the actuary recommends, in the state of Florida, we are required by law to make that contribution. So Florida law is designed not to allow local governments to get behind on their payments against their pension plans and create situations where they're defaulting on pensions. So that's good. It's something that we've always made the actuarially required contribution that we were supposed to make. And as a result, up until this year, we have had no pension liability on our books. We make the payments we're required to make. We have no accumulated liability. It's fine. We report the liabilities and the position of our pension fund back here in the notes, but we don't see it on our financial statements. GASB 68, the new Government Accounting Standards Board pronouncement that took effect this year, has changed all of that. And essentially, it's done a couple of things. It has divorced the accounting for pensions from the funding for pensions. So we will still, and we did, have an actuarial valuation, and that actuarial valuation will still tell us, here's how much money you need to put into your pension plan in order to make yourselves whole within the next 10, 11 years is the track that we're on. And we, by law, will have to make that contribution, and we did. Great. However, from an accounting standpoint, from a financial statement presentation standpoint, none of that actually matters, because what the GASB is now requiring we show in our financial statements is, one, the entire unfunded liability, okay, regardless of whether we've made our required payments. And the unfunded liability that they have us showing is not the unfunded liability based on smoothing of the gains and losses, the actuarial value of our assets. So you have a liability of, we're going to use round numbers, $100 million, and you have assets of $70 million, and your net unfunded liability is 30. That's how we've calculated it in the past based on actuarial numbers, which smooth out those gains and losses over 5-year time frames. The way that you do it under GASB 68 is you show the entire unfunded liability based on your liability minus your market value of your assets. So as you can see, if we have a great year next year, all of a sudden our liability gets a much smaller, and then the next year we have a terrible year, and now the liability on the books is going to be much more volatile than it would have been if there remained a connection between our actuarial valuation and the liability that we're showing on the books. The other thing is the pension expense is no longer what we actually put in. The pension expense is now a combination of what we put in, the change in our net pension liability, and a tiny bit of smoothing for something called deferred outflows and inflows of resources. And we won't even go there because that just gets super accounting-y. So there's some other math involved that means that what shows as the pension expense isn't even the actual money that we put in. So be that as it may, that's what we've done for this year. There's a there's a couple of things I want you to look at. The first thing that we did is, in the past, anything related to the pensions was just shown as a general governmental activity. As soon as we realized that we were going to be, and we're speaking right now entirely of the general employee pension fund. We also have a police pension fund, and we have a small firefighter pension fund, but we're talking about the general employee pension fund. Because we realized we would have to place all of the liabilities on the books, the first thing that we did was go out and allocate to each fund its respective share of the unfunded pension liability. So I want you to look at page 86 with me. So here on page 86 on the left and on 87 on the right, you can see the allocated portion of the total unfunded liability of just over $32 million for the general employee pension plan, and how much went to the general government, how much went to the electric utility, water and sewer, the airport, the marina, and solid waste. Everyone see that? Mm-hmm. And over here on the right-hand side, you can see how much the pension expense was allocated. And again, that was based on each fund's pensionable payroll, so there was a reason for the allocation. There is also, and this is detailed in here, attributable entirely to the general fund, or the general government, if you will, a police officer's pension fund that has a net pension liability, you can see this on page 90, of about $5 million, and a small...
How much was that? I didn't get
about $5.1 million on page 90. And there is a very small lingering firefighter pension plan that has a net pension liability of $1.2 million, again, attributable entirely to the general government. So if we go back to page 32, which is our statement of net position for the entire city, we can see how these numbers impacted that net position. So if you look under liabilities, you can see at the very bottom of long-term liabilities there in that grouping in the middle, Net pension liability for governmental, $19.8 million. For business type activities, that's electric, water, sewer, marina, solid waste, $18.6 million, for a grand total of, for the whole government, of $38.4 million. Everyone with me on those numbers right here? On the balance sheet on page 32? And that is liabilities that never appeared on these books before. There are also, at the top, under assets, some deferred outflows related to pensions, and down on the bottom, some deferred inflows related to pensions, and those are the calculations we were just talking about that give a little bit of an effect of smoothing the pension expense. But as a result of that, if you look at the bottom line, last year we had an unrestricted deficit position in our general government that was minus, what, $4 million?
About 4.
It's minus 22.9 now, all in one fell swoop. The thing about it is, and the actuary came to review the valuation and these results with our pension board, is that this is the same for every single government in the entire country this year. You know, many people have gone from a place where their books now suddenly have an extra 20, 30, 40, we're not in the worst shape, $1 million worth of liabilities and a resulting total deficit unrestricted net position. And, you know, the argument we've made all along is it sort of takes the shock value out of it when every single person has a giant negative number at the bottom of their balance sheet. How do you compare people? Our actuaries, both our police and our general employee pension actuary, are of the opinion, and they've spoken with like bond rating agencies who've said, you know, this is not going to affect our perception of your government. We know who the people are that are fiscally responsible and who make their pension payments when required, and who the people are that don't. So before you put this on your books, we still knew who the people were that were shirking their pension payments and who the people were that weren't. So this is not going to affect, for instance, your bond rating, at least in our opinion. It's going to take some time. These are brand new pronouncements, and these financial statements were issued, you know, in the last month or so for everyone. There are still quite a number of Florida governments who've not been able to issue their financial statements because if they're members of Florida retirement system, all of these numbers that they needed in order to show this pension liability had to come from the Florida retirement system, and they did not actually issue those numbers till about 3 weeks ago. So they were on hold waiting for the FRS. So and then same thing in the business type activities that had a $18 million impact on that 42. The number's still positive. The unrestricted net position of our business type activities is still positive, but it's it's $18 million smaller than it was last year. And when you go over to the individual funds, and again, let's just look at our business type activities because it's much easier to see there. Go over to page 42, 43. Lays open like this and shows you the net position of our various business type entities. Everyone there with me? Again, about 2/3 of the way down the page under non-current liabilities for the electric, water, sewer, the airport, et cetera, you see those net pension liability numbers going across the thing to the $18.6 million. Look at the solid waste fund. Now the solid waste fund has on paper an unrestricted deficit net position when, if you'd have looked at that last year, it was $800,000 to the good. So again, the thing I want to emphasize is this has nothing to do with our cash position. It has nothing to do with how much money we're actually going to put into the pension fund. Nothing to do with any of those things. But it is the new accounting convention, and that's why you see the numbers that you see. I will tell you this, back to, I hate to flip around too much, and this is the last time I'll do it, but if you go back to page 32, the other piece of this puzzle, and I know this is one that Mr. Brevant is always interested in, is the other post-employment benefits. That is essentially for us the only other post-employment benefit, and we've talked about this a bunch, so I won't belabor that point for you again, is the retiree health insurance premiums. That is still under the old way of we don't have a trust fund, and therefore the net pension, the net OPEB liability is the accumulated difference between what we were supposed to put into a trust fund and what we've actually paid. Okay, so you can see that's climbed to about $16 million as of this year end. In 2 more years, the GASB is going to mirror the pension pronouncement with a pronouncement about OPEB that's going to require us to put the entirety of the OPEB liability on the books as well at $35 million. And so that will be the kind of the last blow. By the time we get there, we'll have already accumulated up about 20, so that'll be an extra 15. But again, when we do that, you notice the whole OPEB liability is shown under governmental activities. When we go to do that, I will be allocating the OPEB liability out to the various governmental funds, the various enterprise funds as well, so that they are taking their fair share of that liability.
Yeah, my position has been that, correct, it doesn't affect us at this point, but the reality is, over the last 4 or 5 years, we probably did under expense some of the operations if we'd have been allocating properly to them.
Well, now, but remember, I just want to make sure everyone's clear. The individual enterprise funds paid their pension contributions.
I understand.
They paid their fair share of the pension contributions.
Listen, I'm not
there
arguing.
was no liability on the books for anyone.
Right.
And so when it was time to put liability on the books, I made sure everyone took their fair share of the liability.
But we also knew we were, from our reports, from the actuarial reports, we could see that deficiency was developing right along. And we knew this was coming. Clearly it's had to come. Mm-hmm. That's why I've always argued that, we talk about we got $11 million in cash, and we do. But still, there's a fair amount of it allocated if we had to meet the liabilities as they're sort of construed. We would never go to 100% funding on the pension fund. We might go to 85, but to say we're running around with a lot of cash in our bank is silly. We're not. I don't believe it anyway. And what I have a problem with is when you add it all up, if you go back to page 97, I think I use, or something like that. I think it's 90.
Okay, yeah. That's
97, you look at page 97, and again, this really summarizes it quick, It shows we got $114 million in total pension fund assets. It doesn't show, but there's $38 million in liabilities over and above that, just in the pension funds. Mm-hmm. And when you say, okay, we've got to pay our pension funds, which currently, per this report, is middle of the page, we're paying out benefit payments of $8.5 million, and cash coming in through contributions, top line $5.8 million, interest and dividends, and add it all up, and this is where it gets really tight. On a whole $114 million, it looks like the return to us after expenses was about 1.2%. So if you take this and forward it, it's a pretty bleak picture. Because we're currurently, I know we had a bad year. Stock market was a bad year.
It wasn't great. It was positive, but it wasn't great.
After 4 or 5 years of good years, right? I think we had 3 back-to-back really good years, where we picked up maybe as much as, I don't know, $8-10 million, in the portfolio, right? About that. So, but last year was down. We were down about $800,000. Our expenses were running were about another $700,000. So, out of $3 million, we netted down to us $1.3 million. And when you start saying, okay, we're currently putting in $8.5 million, and our portfolio, despite what the forecasted investment returns are, all the way from 6.5 to 7. The reality is this, and going forward, if you would take this, and you're the investment guy here, right?
Yeah, I was going to bring this particular issue up.
If you go forward on this at 2.5 to 3%, right?
Yeah.
This is pretty.
I will tell you this. Okay, a couple of things. The first thing I think that's the most important to recognize is that the City Council froze this defined benefit plan. The City Council froze this defined benefit plan a year and a half ago. So the liability is now fixed. And essentially...
Excuse me, can I just interrupt?
Sure.
How do you fix that liability? You said earlier ago that our police liability was $5.81 million.
Mm-hmm.
How do you determine that? If we've made all of our contributions that the actuarialists say we have to make, they come up with a number, this is what you have to pay in, you say we've made the payments. Okay, I believe that because I can see the number. How do you get a liability if you've made all the required payments?
Because you have bad years in the stock market.
And so that's it. It's just bad years. Could it be that who determines what the outgo is going to be on our pension payments? How is that figure derived that?
It's contractual.
These number of police officers, when they retire at whatever age, they are to earn and get so much a year. How do you determine that amount?
They're actually, it depends on the plan. If you look again, and I would encourage you to read the note, but in the police officer's pension plan, their pension plan is by ordinance. And so in the city code, there's an ordinance that says, for each year of service, you get this much of a multiplier of your 5 highest years average salary. There's formulas. Okay. So that's established by ordinance, by other, like the pension plan documents, if you will, that are adopted by resolution, like the one we adopted for the freeze of the general employee fund. So depending on what kind of an employee you are, essentially it boils down to 2 things: how long you've been with the city and what your 5 best years' salary was. Those are typically the 2 multipliers.
So it's fairly easy then to determine the monetary obligation that we have to pay out.
It is.
The big deal, though, is
based on actuarial tables. Now, knowing how long, essentially it's what you've promised to pay people and your projection as to how long they're going to live and when they're going to retire.
Okay.
The big deal is the discount rate.
But again, let me with that. Okay, first of all, there's some data in the actuarial valuation. I would encourage you to look at it. That plays out across 30, 40 years, 50 years, the discount rates, the liabilities, the interest earnings, the diminishment of the funds, et cetera. So the actuaries don't ignore that. The second thing is that the discount rates we used for a long time mirrored the Florida retirement system, and they are at 7 3/4. Every single one of the city's pension plans has lowered their discount rate consistently for the last 3 or 4 years. And as a result of the freeze of the plan for the general employee pension plan, we were required by the state of Florida to lower our discount rate to 6.5. If you look at our 5 and 10-year performance, it's pretty close to that. Again, we're not talking about investments that are 5-year investments. We're talking about 30, 40-year horizons. So, again, it's not that we're expecting 10% return. We've never examined that. We've, conducted ourselves in accordance with the law. We've conducted ourselves prudently in accordance with what's actually been happening for the last few years. The last thing is on the general employee pension plan, which is different now because it's frozen. One of the things that we've already talked about with the pension board, with the actuary, and with our investment advisor is that now that this is a closed plan, and therefore there are no more contributions. There are only payments and investment earnings, that we are going to have to adjust our portfolio mix as time goes by. Just as you would if you were a single person with a fixed amount of money that had to last you till the end of your life, to acknowledge the fact that this is a closed plan and it will never have any injection from contributions again. So it is certainly something that if you want some great reading, go to the city's website under the finance reports for 14-15, and all of the actuarial valuations are there with all of the demographic data in the back, age of populations, when people are going to retire, discount rates, 30-year scenarios. It's all there.
But the liability is a function mainly. You have the formulas, and the formulas determine how much people are going to be paid out. But this is way out in the future. Okay, so the question then is, well, what rate do we discount that back to the present? The bigger the discount rate you use, the smaller your liability. Okay, and so one of the things that I see that municipalities do is they use the same discount rate as their expected rate of return. So that's what we're doing. Our expected rate of return is 6.5%. The discount rate. Now that's not what typically happens with corporate.
And I think that might have actually started changing with the GASB one too. If you look at the way it's played out in the 30-year pronouncements, there's two other things that you'll find in here as well. one of the things that we're required to do for the state of Florida, and this is also on the city's website, is to make some projections mirroring the state retirement system as to how things would go. And then we also, this is an interesting number that we put in there for exactly this reason. If you look at page, let's stick with the general retirement fund.
Page 86.
And look at page 86, yeah. And basically, what we're required to do is to show the sensitivity analysis, if you will, of what would happen at different discount rates, both plus and minus 1%. So there, if you look at the bottom of page 86, you can see what impact it would have on the liability to lower it to 5.5, to increase it to 7.5. So that what you're saying is you kind of see the relative magnitude. You know, again, we could talk about this for about a week. You know, it's such there's been so much regulation, so much concern at the state level. So much reviewed by the Department of Retirement.
Let me just interject here.
Sure.
This is probably the single riskiest and most dangerous thing that most municipalities face across the entire country. And this is something that we probably do need to spend a fair amount of time on it and make some sort of, have some sort of position on. You mentioned that the last 10 years have shown that we made this amount of money, and then that justifies this rate of return. Past performance is no guarantee of future returns.
In either direction.
What's that?
In either direction.
Well, that's true.
Agreed. But in either direction.
But one of the things you have to understand is we're starting with interest rates very, very low. Okay, so 10 years ago, interest rates were much higher than they are today. That in and of itself, you're not going to get better than 1 or 2%, or maybe if you go out really long, you'll get 3 or 3.5% or something. I don't know what our duration is on the investments in the bond portfolio, but if you're less than 10 years, 2-3% is about what you're going to get. So that's going to be significantly less than what you got 10 years ago. So that's guaranteed. The positions that we have right now in our fixed income are absolutely guaranteed. That's the interest rate we're getting going forward. Okay. Now the question becomes, well, what about stock returns? Can we count on that? And I can tell you from a valuation perspective, one of the best predicted short-term stock returns are impossible to predict, okay? But long-term stock returns actually aren't as hard to predict. And the reason is because what you can do is you can just basically look at, well, there's a thing called the Cape-Shiller 10-year PE ratio, and it smooths out the ups and downs in operating earnings for the overall economy, for the S&P 500. And you can see what the 10-year PE is basically, and that gives you a very good idea of what your valuation is, okay? We're in one of the top 3 highest valuations in the last 100 years right now. And not only that, profit margins are elevated to some degree. So your overall earnings growth is not going to be there. There's a lot of other factors for why revenue growth isn't going to be there to the extent that it was over the last 30 or 40 years. But to make a long story short, you're going to be lucky to get 2 or 3% on stocks over the next 10 years. And so what we need to figure out is, if that's true, if we're going to make 2 or 3% on stocks and we're going to make 2 or 3% on bonds, what does that mean for? We need to plan for that. This is because not only that, and I see also that they're basically marking our pension plan. You just said they're marking our pension plan to market the liability. What happens if the stock market falls 40%? I mean, what happens to our liability?
Then our liability will rise accordingly. So a couple of things, we need to break this up into bits. So in terms of the investment portfolio and our monitoring that for the future, I mean, again, we've lowered the discount rate. We've lowered it consistently over the last few years. We have acknowledged, the pension committee has, along with our investment advisor and our actuary, that it has to be lowered yet again, particularly because this is a closed plan. The thing to keep in mind is that when you lower it, okay, you greatly impact not only the liability, but also the payments that are required each year. So again, you don't want massive fluctuations. The second thing is that this gets examined annually. And so if the actuary says, look, you put in $4 million a year and you're going to be fully funded in 10 years, then we don't just get to put $4 million in a year and say our work is done. Every year we get a new actuarial valuation with a new analysis of what needs to be put in, and no matter what, we have to put that money in. So until the unfunded liability goes away, the unfunded liability doesn't go away.
So expect to keep paying more and more money every
perhaps,
year. That's what's going to happen.
Or continue to adjust your investment expectations downward. What, for instance, the police and the fire pension funds have done is they've lowered it by 0.25 every single year for the last 3 or 4 years. They may stop and they may not. They may continue to lower it annually by an incremental amount till they get to a place where they feel a comfort level, and that's another way to do it. So again, what you're after is to be fiscally responsible and prudent, but also not to have wild fluctuations in what you're reporting or what you're paying in if as you monitor it continually. The big difference, and I understand everyone's concern, trust me, when you look at what happened in other places and other states in particular, and in other municipalities, there are some pretty big horror stories. The good thing, if you will, for us is that no matter what, we are required to continue making our payments toward this pension liability. And not on an individual year. The people that got in trouble were the people who went, oh my God, we got to put in $5 million this year? I tell you what, I got an idea. We don't really have it this year. Maybe we'll put in 10 next year. And 5 years went by, and now they have no money in their pension fund. So, and there was constant monitoring. And believe me, it is not just us or the pension committee that monitors it or the auditors that monitor it. It's the state of Florida Department of Financial Services. So, again, I hear your argument that we should lower our expectation to 3%. But for us to go and just say, well, 3% next year, that's it. Yeah. It would be not the way that we would approach it.
We should at least model it though, because we need to have an idea of what happens if under this kind of scenario, and how much more money we're going to have to be putting aside, because we have all these projections for everything else that we're doing, but this is going to eat that up if these 6.5% returns don't pan out.
And we have modeled it, and that's what I'm saying. I would love to, if you want, let me show you the actuarial valuation, some of the supplementary information they're required to produce by GASB 16.7 and 68. They have to do this big schedule where they say, okay, based on this assumption, here's where the money runs out year by year, and then if we modify it either direction, that's part of the reason for the sensitivity analysis being here, but this is the summary of other work that's been done. So, certainly there has been some modeling, and there certainly can be some more.
Do they have it down to 3% in here, or 3.5%?
They don't have it down to 3% in here. They're not required to do that. But you can see how they've played it out. You can see by the sensitivity what will happen.
But the point is, there isn't anything we can do about it.
Well,
really, because you closed the plan. So
we've taken the one single step that we could take that has the biggest impact. We've frozen this, no new entrants and no additional accruals for anybody that's in it. So the first big step, and I will tell you, that is a huge step. That is something a lot of governments have not done. That is big, to simply say, that's it, we're done with this. And now all we have to do is make sure that we fund this thing that's before us, and not something that's going to continue, the liabilities will continue to grow.
It might clarify the issue to separate what is accounting and put in this report and what is a problem of the city that we have to face and should discuss. This is based on accounting rules and regulations that have come a long way from cost, where you only reported costs. Now we're reporting estimated values, mark to market, a little at a time. They weren't willing to jump to current rates, as you suggest, where they change from year to year. And it will move in that direction. So to me, this is what is required. It's the first step in terms of moving the financial statements to market, and we will do that. And I also agree, though, that we do have a problem as a city. We have an overhang that we must start addressing. To me, that's separate from what has to be reported in this report. You don't have a lot of choice in terms of what goes in here.
No. Yeah, I would think what is required and what is accepted is what we should have in the statements. So I can't. If 6.5 is what is accepted, then that's what you put in the statements, because it's not a real number anyway, because you do not know exactly. It's probably higher because
we have to address that.
But either what do you do to fund it now? Raise taxes, or do you raise taxes when you actually start paying it and face the problem? What do we have? What can we do about funding it? We're going
to have to pay more and more money.
The only way you could do that is to raise taxes now or later.
Or maybe we'll have, instead of being able to stop funding it in 10 years with our $4 million, that right now we're on a trajectory at that discount rate to be fully funded in 10 years. Maybe it takes 15 years to be fully funded. But the big point is our big difference between other people is that the liability number is not going to change anymore. Right. It's only going to grow smaller as people pass away. And that was not true a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, before we froze this plan, that liability number was going to, kind of continue to be a moving target as well. So at least you've nailed that.
No, freezing it's a good definitely
it's
a good
huge
step.
first step.
But freezing, the freezing was just under the general employees, not the police department.
Not the police department,
okay.
No.
Who sets that formula for the police? Is that done by the state?
No.
Do we have a say in it, the city?
We did. Part of that formula is set by union negotiations. For instance, the General Employee Retirement Fund formula was changed about 4 or 5 years ago as a result of union negotiations. So the city cannot make like a unilateral change to the retirement plan. But
so it's up between the city and the union as to the formula payout for the police.
There is another small wrinkle on the police pension plan.
Yeah.
One way that the police pension plan is funded is through the use of fire and insurance premium taxes. And as a result, because the city accepts that funding to defray its costs on the police pension plan, there are some rules as to the minimum benefits that we can provide by taking that money. So that's, in a nutshell, an overview of a very complicated issue. But if the state says, here's some fire insurance premium tax to help defray your costs of a police pension plan, you're not allowed to dial those benefits back below a minimum required level.
I see.
Without
issue
not taking the money.
Of pension liability justifies a subcommittee of the Finance Commission. It's so large.
Well,
Cindy, let me ask another question. On our general fund, we froze it. I understand that. But as this statement begins to show, the mark-to-market this year was $400,000 or $500,000 down. Doesn't that mean that if we would go through this, maybe next 3 or 4 years, a down market, doesn't it mean we would have to pick up some of our funding to bring us back up where we're beginning to fund totally? Or would we stay on your fixed, as you're saying?
My understanding is that because we froze the plan, we were required to go to flat amortization and not, when you have an active plan, you're allowed to reset your time frame, if you will, over time. My understanding is that there's a component, a kind of a fixed component now that we've frozen it to our target to be 100% funded.
But as Nathan says, take a 10% down, boom, and it happens. We've seen it. If you take a 10% down in your portfolio, now you're another $6 million short. Let's just pick a figure. Mm-hmm. Now, over a period of time, if we don't refund that, then at some point, we may never catch up with the needs of our former employees, right? So we would have to kick in some money, right?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, that's happened to us for the last 4 or 5 years. Remember, this, as I stated earlier, this way that we reported it has nothing to do with the way that we fund it. The way that we fund it is based on the actuarial valuation. And over the course of the last 5 years, we've had years where we had bad investment years where our required contribution for that year went up dramatically from what we originally thought it would be, $500,000, $600,000, $800,000. And that will continue to be the case. If we have planned a trajectory that doesn't pan out, the requirements for our contributions will rise accordingly so that we continue on a trajectory to fund this plan. But not, I hear what you, trust me, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
But to go to 3% instantly would be a huge impact in 1 year. So,
have you guys considered or explored like a buyout to end, basically just end the pension plan? I think that might be a pretty good way to go. And
we have both our investment advisor and our actuary have told us that that would be something that maybe in another 3 or 4 years might be worth our while, but given the current volatility and the unfunded liability, it would be very expensive. So it's something we've talked about. It's something we talked about before the freeze, and then the freeze actually took a year or so to effect because of the union negotiations. It's something that we have discussed taking back out and looking at again.
So what are you waiting for in 3 or 4 years? What happens in 3 or 4 years from today?
In 3 or 4 years, theoretically, we'll be about halfway to more fully funded. And
because of the money that we're putting in, or
because of the money that we're putting in. And again, that 3 or 4 year mark was back. You were part of this conversation with Glenn with them. And if you recall, what was the other concern they had about it being expensive? Do you recall this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it was we were more unfunded for sure, and apparently they've tried it, and other cities have done it on a smaller basis. And I think Sebastian tried it a couple times, and they got a couple people out. But not a lot of people took that deal.
But yeah, it's not off the table. It would be great. I mean, to just be out from under it and done.
Yeah.
So.
And the results, we've compared the results of group financing, group investing versus non-group, and it's pretty clear the employees over time do better in a group than they would individually. Sure. A lot of them don't have the ability to invest it properly.
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about the finances of the city here. So,
I understand. But when you compare the results, they're pretty significant difference.
I agree.
No doubt about it. And but I've been concerned about this all along because I do think, what worries me, and it does other people, like our colleague out the back there, we're in a city that's not growing. I mean, it is what it is. We can't blow out the borders any, and we're not bringing in a lot of commercial. So our tax base is really tight. The lid of. And this whole business to the utility has caused a lot of uncertainty out here. And I know there are a lot of people around town that want to get rid of the utilities, blah, blah, blah. But without that utility fund, this is just flat not fundable, period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are other problems. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to start funding this other benefit program at some point, and the budget every year goes up, and we don't make any headway. And we keep pushing the ball back, and I clearly understand what we're up against.
Could I ask a procedural question? Since the thing that Daniel brought up about a subcommittee, it's difficult to identify the issue and stick to an issue for the full commission.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And is it possible to form a subcommittee that could talk about this and identify the things that have to be decided so that we could, in an orderly fashion, address them as a commission in terms of what we think?
Procedurally,
would you need city council approval?
Procedurally, I don't believe you can form subcommittees. I will tell you, though, that there is already a General Employee Pension Committee that has the responsibility for establishing discount rates and accepting, established by city ordinance. And so one of the things that Mr. Brevant had done when he first became interested in this is he would attend those meetings. So, I mean, that's certainly an option as well, that next time there's a General Employee Pension Committee meeting, if you have concerns or you want to make suggestions about ways to tackle this, attend the meeting, and you can do that, right? And even if there's two of them
so
there, they're allowed to both be there?
They're addressing the financial
they
part.
can attend the meeting, yes, they just cannot discuss it until you're in your finance committee.
That's what I'm talking about. Why I ask about procedures, because can a committee of sub-3 still
Not
has
of the finance
to be
commission,
public?
you can't. No.
Still has to be public.
No, because then it would have to come in front of the full
To me,
finance
the ideal
commission.
would be some way to develop a model plan for addressing this issue.
I don't think we can do that, John.
Yeah.
We can't do it.
But what
I
we
don't
can
think so.
do, and what Mr. Brevant did, it would be great, I think, for you, if you have the time to come to one of those meetings where our investment advisor's there, you could have a chance to, because you've had the chance to do that, talk with Dean Molinaro from Prudential, which I think would be a good conversation, and then also address the committee. Just say, hey, these are my concerns, and these are things you might think about. And our actuary is extremely knowledgeable as well, and is worth talking
What
with as well.
meetings are those? What committee is this?
The General Employee Pension Committee. They're on the city calendar.
General?
Actually, I think we have one next week, don't we? We do.
as well as the police and the
General
Police.
Employee what?
Pension Committee.
Pension Committee.
Yeah, it's made up of 5 members of the city staff.
And they address the financing,
everything.
everything.
Well,
And go over periodic results and report back on all of the data on an updated basis.
By financing, I was thinking relative to the rest of the city budget, where it fits. That which is
solely on the pension.
Our responsibility.
But again, not to. I think for me, absolutely not to dismiss anyone's concern. This is the biggest thing that we have to crack, and it's one of the hugest impacts on our budget every year. It's about $4.5 million citywide that we make of a payment every year. But again. What's the concrete things we can do? The first most impactful one was freezing the plant. I mean, that was a huge step, and we've done it. So that was a tough one, and we got past that. So now, continuing to make our payments as required and continuing to monitor the results, and maybe over time, we've already acknowledged as a committee that over time we do need to lower the discount rate just to line up with the fact that we don't have an active plan anymore. There's no more money coming in, and theoretically, what you want is for it to run out when the last person cashes that last check. So
one of the possibilities is buyout. And what I'm thinking is that if we had it structured so here's the point where we would realistically consider buyout. It would be nice to know.
Well, you talk about we have properties for sale, Dodgertown, things like that. I mean, I think it might be worth, just throwing out the idea of basically biting the bullet on this thing when we sell those properties and putting the money into it.
And one of the discussion, Nathan, is to potentially consider any basis that we got from Dodgertown to address the OPEB, the post-retirement employee benefits on one hand, because what happened, we had made recommendations. This commission has made recommendations to the city council at the last budget meeting, and they just took a pass ball on it. Yeah. On particularly on what you brought up and what you were championing, Glenn. So I think one of the things that would be helpful. Now that we've exposed this in more detail to the commission, is to focus on this, to have our members who wants to go to the meeting and then reconvene, and prior to the budget hearings that are in July, for the commission to put out, for us to have a spokesperson with Cindy to discuss the seriousness of the issue and the pros and the cons and the options for the council to begin to get serious both about the pension and the OPEB.
Well, I will tell you this. Jim had already put an item on the council agenda to get some direction from them for this year's budget, and they've already told he and I both that they want us to include the funding of an OPEB liability in the first draft of the budget, or an OPEB trust fund. So that's something that we're going to throw into the mix for the budget workshops in July to see if we can tackle that. Can I say one more thing about the pension thing? And when we have this committee meeting next week, even if you're not able to come, I am a member of that committee, and what I will do is add to that agenda a discussion of the buyout of the pension plan, and we'll start talking about that again. Go back to our investment advisors and actuaries and things, and say, okay, here we are 2 years down the road. Give us a white paper, some guidance as to whether you think this is viable, that we could go out and market this and have a reinsurer buy it and be done with it.
If you're talking about lump sum payments to participants.
Excuse me?
If you're talking about lump sum payments to participants?
No, we're talking about essentially someone buys this pension plan from us and then funds it correct.
Well, or you could do that as well. I'm
just getting off the books. I was beginning to look at those defined benefit plans, and I don't know if you can do those much longer.
I don't think we can force lump sum payments on retirees without a whole bunch of additional.
No, you can't force it. You can't force it.
It's only an option.
Yeah.
But I will add that to our agenda, whether you're there or not.
And you guys going to talk about the discount rate as well, or is that on there as well?
We talked about that when we did the actuarial evaluation, and we did talk about lowering it in the future. We have already lowered it. We lowered it in 1 year from 7.5 to 6.5. But we've already taken that step in this past year. So.
And that is a reporting requirement we're talking about again on the financial statements. That's not what we're talking about in calculating buyouts or. Realistic.
No, but it influences how much money we have to put in, or if we still think we're still going to make 6.5% on our money, we get to put in less money this year, to some extent. That's kind of how that works.
Yeah.
But not next year. I think the thing I'm emphasizing is that no matter what you have as a discount rate, the amount of money you actually have to put in over time is predicated on what really happens to you and not what you said will.
Right.
So again, over the last few years, as things have risen and fallen in terms of return, we've actually had years where we had to put in more money than we thought, and some years where we actually had to put in less, and that won't change at all.
Cindy, you mentioned that the police's pension is not frozen.
Police pension is not frozen.
And most pensions are based on base salary. In their formula, do they have overtime in there? Because
there is some. Oh wow! There are state law. There are state law exclusions of certain portions of overtime over X amount in a year, et cetera. Police pensions are extremely complicated, so I can answer that question, but I won't do it off the top of my head. Yeah. There's a synopsis in the CAFR in the note that explains what their pension calculation is, and I believe it does talk about the overtime rules. But again, police pensions are a whole separate ball of wax because of our acceptance of the premium tax money. They're governed by Florida statutes as well as our local pension plans. They're called local law plans, and they're completely different than just local plans. So. Yeah.
But our unionized, the fire department, the police department are the best funded. They're both of them, about 85% funded.
Yeah,
they've always been well funded.
Their investment returns were worse than the general employee plan this past year.
Nobody did well this last year.
So I mean, they're funded at
We're
3 or 4 or 5% better. They're not at 100% themselves.
Yeah, we're about 70% funded.
Are we 70?
About 70. Mm-hmm.
But again, keeping in mind, part of the reason, this is the last thing, part of the reason that our liability went up is our liability actually went up when we froze the plan, because we were no longer going concern. So there were a whole bunch of things like increases in salaries and discounts and other things associated with this plan being an active plan that went away when we froze it, and assumptions that had to change, including the lowering of the discount rate, that sent our liability up dramatically and instantly caused our funding position to get worse as we froze the plan. And we knew that would happen. We knew when we froze it, it would make it worse initially, but then it would never change, and then we could climb out of it.
Is everybody mark to market, or is it just frozen plans that are marked to market?
Everybody is now required to report it.
That's a pretty risky
that is the
position that they've decided to change, because that's exactly what happened to the financial institutions in 2008, 2009, was they had to mark everything to market, and as the values continued to go down, they had to keep marking it to market, and things just kept getting worse and worse, spiraling out of control. So, I mean, you could sort of foresee a scenario where the stock market goes down 30 or 40%, which would not be an unusual occurrence in stock market history. And all of a sudden, there's a huge hole in everybody's pension plan, and everybody has to mark that to market. The liabilities all go up. Now everybody's got to pay more in interest rates.
But remember, okay, back to the beginning. We have to show the market value of the assets in the accounting, in the financial reporting. This has nothing to do with the funding. The way the funding works, the actuarial funding works, is it has a 5-year smoothing. So although there is an impact from a bad year, that impact is you take the loss, you divide it by 5, and you recognize it over a 5-year period. Same with gains. And so you don't have, it helps take some of the volatility out of the funding by doing that smoothing. So we're still allowed to fund on the actuarial.
Yeah, Councilman has been very patient.
Well, no, this is excellent. Is this on? This is an excellent conversation, and you're wise to have it. I'm glad you are having it. 2 footnotes. I attended a session that Dick Haviland put on from Indian River Shores, and I quote him, but are 2 governments that are frozen, Jupiter and Vero Beach, according to that presentation, and one that's done a buyout, Indian River Shores. Just as footnotes, they're few and far between. But I think you're onto something. First of all, with what's going on with debt around the world, in particular China, 240, I mean, it's gone up exponentially in the last year. You're certainly going to see a collapse in the stock market in the next some short period, intermediate to short period of time. I would suggest to you there's a model for something you all can do, and I think you need to consider doing it. Glenn did some work independently, which was good work. And back when we were trying to decide what to do with the $30 million working capital balance out of the electric at the culmination of the sale, which hasn't happened at this point, Peter Gorey did something called the Gorey Plan, and we looked at funding the pension with the $30 million. The reason I bring this to your attention is I think you have a difficulty as a commission really dealing with this, except as a commission. But you could certainly have John look at buyout, in other words, the Dodgertown money, whatever it happens to be, whatever funding can be gotten, possibly debt or whatever, and I think it needs to be looked at. I mean, or even a partial buyout. It makes a lot of sense. And I think this whole thing, the 6.5 when we were 8, I pushed 6 years ago to try to get to 7 3/4 and never got there. But I think what Cindy mentioned, someone to look at changing the 6.5 over time, maybe 1/4% a year. She put out as a recommendation, so it becomes 6 1/4, 6, and so on. And maybe Nathan takes that since he's an expert in that area, and then come back to the committee as a whole with some views for you all to look at. There's no question this is hanging over the top of us, and I'm really suggesting to you a mechanism. You could appoint one person to look at one thing and one another, and then come back as a committee of the whole look at it. And the timing of it is perfect because, in July we're going to have to do a budget, and if we're going to change the rate from 6.5 to 6 1/4, if we're going to say whatever we get out of the sale of Dodgertown we're going to use for whatever, that we need your recommendation on it, in my opinion. So I'm just encouraging you to keep digging. That's it. Thank you for the minute. I'm Dick Winger, by the way. I didn't say that at the start.
I'd also point out that if the stock market does happen to fall 30 or 40%, you can keep your discount rate where it is, because then your expected returns will be higher going forward.
Well, one of the things that is ironic, 3 years ago, we were told, based upon the actuarial estimates at that time and the rules of the game at that time, that in 10 years it would be fully funded. Well, this is 3 years later, and we're still talking 10 years for a whole host of reasons, and we understand them. But Dick was making a recommendation, and that's what I was alluding to, that if rather than 5 people go to the pension, is to you've been running with both OPEB and the pension.
Sometimes, yeah.
And if other members want to take a piece part,
I would volunteer for what Dick suggested to try to match Dodgertown with buyout possibilities.
So you're talking, well, it's not only Dodgertown, we also have old diesel plant. Yeah. So you may want to talk to see what other assets potentially could be monetized.
Let's clarify the Dodgertown thing a little bit, though. Right now, we have outstanding debt on Dodgertown that's over $6 million. So if we sell Dodgertown, then we could certainly continue to pay the debt and just take the proceeds from the sale of Dodgertown and put it against the pension plan, but it won't alleviate that debt. That debt is currently being paid out of the 1 cent sales tax fund, and one of the other things that I had heard as a potential use of the Dodgertown money was to lower the debt payments out of the 1 cent sales tax fund, so we would have more money for street paving and capital projects, which is certainly going to be, again, that's going to be probably the fund that gets the most anxiety this year's budget season, because we have a lot of pent-up projects and not a lot of money. So, that's just something to consider.
That will be true of any funds that we identify.
Yeah.
And we also have the stormwater issue of potential utility, but there's no reason not to. And I think Nathan, with what you're pointing out, is really the Achilles heel in terms of what the discount rate is. The rest of it is essentially manageable, unless you have a collapse. And when you have the collapse, it doesn't matter what these other peripherals are. You're just going to have to either default or you're...
So the goal is to get out from under this as quickly and as easily as we can.
Yeah. So I think one of those keys is looking at what a potential buyout would be of the frozen plant. Yeah. And I think that has merit in terms of, if it's affordable.
And again, I'll take that as an action to the pension committee, which I'm a part of at the meeting next week, and put on an agenda item and say, hey, maybe we should talk about this buyout thing again, and marshal or get the information together and talk about the buyout thing as on the committee. So if you're there, you can get up and
what time is it?
I don't know. It's on the city calendar. I'm looking at Sherry. Maybe she's got the internet.
I do have a day job that I go to.
Yeah, exactly. This is why I'm saying to you, don't feel like you have to drop what you're doing and come to the pension committee. I will make sure that gets on the agenda.
2:30.
I want to say it's either 1:30 or 2:30, I believe.
Even if you don't, I'll make sure that I add that to the agenda and that we address that. And then you can call me if you want, and I can tell you what we took as a next step.
Just connect with Cindy and obviously.
The problem is 2 of us can't be at the same meeting either.
I promise I'll add it to the.
You can attend the same meeting, you just can't
so.
discuss it.
Oh.
You can all attend any meeting that you want, you just can't discuss it
We're not allowed
amongst
to even be in the
yourself.
same room with each other at any point in time, other than right here.
And even now is questionable. So I will do that, and you can call me, and I will convey all that to the pension committee. And
I will tell you though, comparing the years, this whole section on the retirement funds, and that's a really intense analysis. It really is.
Well, thank you, because I did that. So
it's really intense. It takes a lot of time.
I have to take a little credit for this CAFR. I will tell you, that 68 conversion was painful. I will look at my friend, Mr. Smith, who kind of knows what I'm saying. It was a completely different approach. It was luckily for us, for the city, we have very good actuaries. The journal entries, the restatement of the
reason they worked on this
position.
for years was not easy for the board either.
And the cash flow analysis is a more corporate statement, so you really can pinpoint it a little better. So I thought the presentation was better. The only thing I saw in that we didn't have our old schedules that. Remember I had the schedule that showed.
They took those out. I know. They're still there. They're still there in the actuarial evaluations, though.
They're there.
Those schedules that show the ARC versus the funding and those percentages, they're still there in the actuarial.
I didn't find that as easily, but
I tried my best to get them to keep them in here, and was informed by my auditors I could not because they were removed and they were not part of the required presentation. I thought they were great schedules and should be in here. So. Not that this wasn't. Can I point out just a couple other things about the CAFR, because I don't want to take up. We're running kind of late. If we're ready to leave the pension thing, are we for a little while? Okay. So, if you would look at, we talked about that. Maybe page 38. These are just some quick highlights of our results. So other than the government-wide that includes all those liabilities and things we just talked about and the OPEB and things, as I stated, that doesn't really have any impact on what we actually put in or our cash. And so this page shows you the results of operations for the city's general fund, budget versus actual amounts, and how much we ended the year with in terms of beginning fund balance and ending fund balance. That's on page 38. I would like to point out that our original budget, and this is something that we've talked about before, you really need to compare the actual expenditures to the original budget to get a feeling for how accurate the budgeting process is, because the actual expenditures compared to what we thought they were going to be the previous July. And if you look at the total expenditures, original budget of $19.999557 and the eventual actual amounts of $19,840, that is a 0.8% difference from the original budget to the actual expenditures. So I would submit that we've with your help and with quarterly reviews and quarterly variance analysis, we've gotten very, very good at budgetary compliance. This is a different number than it would have been 3-4 years ago when actual amounts tended to be a little higher than original budgets, and sometimes a lot. And so our fund balance did grow between coming in $150K under expenditures and about $250 over on revenues. Our fund balance grew about $400,000 more than we expected. And if you look on page 34, which is our actual balance sheet for the general fund and our other funds, you'll see that we've got an unassigned fund balance. That's the amount that's available to be allocated per the policy you just adopted of $9.8 million. So that would go $2 million, if based on the policy you just adopted, $2 million would go to emergencies, and then the rest would go to the budget stabilization, et cetera. The other thing I just want to point out is there's a section of this CAFR that's really, really useful that everyone forgets because it's sort of in the back, and that is the statistical section. There is a wealth of great information in here, and I will point to 2 pages for you, and then maybe that'll encourage you to look at the rest. Look at page 152. As we come into budget season, I think this is a great chart. This is a chart that shows the direct and overlapping government property tax rates here in Indian River County. So this is essentially the total ad valorem taxes that you would pay if you have a property in the city of Vero Beach and who they go to. And if you look, in 2015, the total tax rate was 17.3 mils, $17.31 on $1,000 of assessed value. Of that total amount, $2.03 goes to the city of Vero Beach. And I bring this up every year, and I bring it up during budget season because I want people to understand when we talk about the city's budget, I want them to take it in context of their total tax bill. The city council controls something on the neighborhood of 11 or 12% of your total tax bill. Certainly if you look at the amount that goes to the school district, which is almost 4 times what the city of Vero Beach has as a proportional piece of your tax rate, or even the Indian River Memorial Hospital District. The hospital district alone is almost half as much as the entire millage rate for the city of Vero Beach. So, I think that in terms of your total tax bill, when you live within the city, you're getting a tremendous amount of services and value for that $2 as a percentage of the total amount. So when people hear that the city's tax rate is going up, I think they immediately jump to the conclusion that their entire $17 is going up by 3% or whatever, but this is the proportional amounts that come from the different sources. I think that's worth looking at. 155 is another really good piece of information. This is our 10 largest electric customers and our 10 largest water customers. And so you can see the amount of revenue we take in from our biggest customers. Okay, thank you. And for instance, the hospital was our largest electric utility customer last year. Revenue of $2.9 million. They represent 3% of our sales. For instance, when we were having conversation, and we still are, about Piper and the possibility that Piper would go with some solar power, well, you can see where Piper Aircraft sits as a total percentage of our sales, which would give you a feeling for what kind of an impact that might have on our bottom line if Piper were to cut their bills to the city in half, which is not as, I think, big as anyone had the impression it would be. And just so on and so forth. Page 163, another really, I think, instructive and useful chart, and this is the last one I'll point to, that shows the citywide totals by general government and business type activities of total staffing from 2006 to now. In 2006, the city had total employees citywide of 537, with 272 just in the city's general government. As of last year, that was 203 and 391. So certainly during those difficult years of falling property tax rates, et cetera, the city undertook some serious reductions in staffing to meet the required taxes. There's all kinds of great data in here. And with that, it was an interesting year thanks to the GASB, but I think we produced a quality product. And the note I was handed said that the pension committee meeting is on Wednesday, June the 1st at 2:30 p.m.
June 1st.
So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have now or later as you have a chance to dive into this.
Any questions?
Cindy, I got one. Sure. On your attachment A, through the summary of expenses, revenue, and revenue surplus, you've got on the other revenue requirements, a transfer to the R&R fund, Fund 403. I don't see 403 in any of these books. Do you know what fund that is?
403 is the R&R fund. It is in the adopted budget, and it's the capital fund of the electric utility. It's the sub-fund that does all the capital improvements for the electric utility. Repair and replacement is what the R&R stands for.
Thank you.
So with that, with the completion of that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have, and otherwise I think that's it for my part of the agenda. Sorry for talking so much.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make one comment for the record to thank the city staff and its employees and the manner in which they handled the torrential rain storms that we had. compared to some of the other locations. I know they were working around the clock, both in the electric, in public works, obviously our public safety and water sewer. But one of the things that Monty just told me is that every year they, prior to hurricane seasons, tropical storm seasons, they dredge and clean the 20 miles of canals. They clean all of the buffers and the strainers, and they had done that this year. But that, he said, is one of the major contributions to why the drainage was really well, given the amount that we hit. So I wanted to thank the city staff and all of its members for too often don't get the credit. Other on the next meeting, I think we can set a date. Before that, is there any other comments from the members in terms of we're really getting down? I think prior to this year's budget, I think that based upon our discussions, as I mentioned, of both the pension and OPEB, specifically, we should come back to the city council prior to the budget hearings and give them some issues, concerns, and a report on where they should consider as their priorities and some options that.
Mr. Chairman, maybe Cindy knows this. Cindy, can we pull out all the data, the old data we generated on the OPEC deal? Don't you have all that?
I do, and I will tell you, the City Council budget workshops are July the 13th. And right now, staff is in the process of, putting together that draft and going through internal reviews, et cetera. I have every intention, per council's direction, of including those OPEB numbers so that they can make a decision about them in that first round of the workshops.
I was just saying,
yeah. So I have the analysis I did last year. I just put the updated numbers in it. That'll give me some numbers. But more importantly, the way that we normally do this is we'll have those budget workshops, and then once council has decided, what it is they are good with and not good with in that budget, they'll send it back to you guys for further review. The timing is such that that's probably the way that it will go, because it is already June for all intents and purposes. So, to have another meeting and have the data in front of us between now and then won't likely happen.
I was just suggesting if we could pull it back out, maybe then we could circulate it to new members on the committee, and they could read it and sort of get up to speed and not have to.
I think we had an agenda item with a bunch of stuff attached to it last year. Maybe Sherry and I can.
Yeah, maybe we can find all that.
In the presentation.
Yeah, we could find that and help get everybody up to speed a little bit rather than trying to relearn everything again.
Actually, I had a thought. Is there somewhere where the investment portfolio for the pension, you can see what it is, where it's invested?
Yeah, we have quarterly financial reports, and those are.
Are they on the website, or?
They're not on the website. The detail of the pie charts and where they're actually invested, and he's seen them. I can make sure you get one.
Okay.
So why don't you send the latest one to all the members?
It actually is online right now. I'd say they're not on, but they are. They probably are online, attached to this agenda for the meeting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you go to the city website where you would get agendas for meetings,
it's in there.
This is an advertised meeting, so I believe it probably is attached.
There were like 386 pages, so I didn't go through all of it.
That's the point.
Yeah. But there's a summary page.
Okay.
There's
I had it on there.
Pie chart, and there's a summary page. If you don't see it on there, I'll go have a look. If it's not on there,
Okay.
I'll send it out. Because sometimes they get on here, they're not in color, and they're not that much use if they're not in color, those pie charts. So I think what I'm suggesting, though, just in practical terms, in terms of timing, that the opportunity to have another meeting and have that conversation before the budget workshops, the council budget workshops, probably really isn't there. We're almost there. So, typically what will happen is we'll be back to you in August, and then you'll have your chance to kind of sort through what's left and what council has sent back to you.
At the very least, I would, prior to the budget hearings, express what our concerns are, if not the details, to the council, because And I know that staff is going to as well, but and I know we're going to get it back after the council looks at it. But I think the degree of seriousness should be elevated to, from a green to a yellow to somewhere between a dark amber in terms of, what is confronting us as we go forward.
Again, keeping in mind that that the OPEB will be in there. That council's already directed us to include that if we can. And the pension thing, the lowering of the discount rate wouldn't really happen until the actuarial evaluation for this year has already kind of been done. So, and that sets the contribution for the current year because of the way the timing works. So that, would affect next year, but only after it's already been budgeted. So it doesn't really have an impact per se on the budgeting process unless we were to dramatically lower it. So again, it is June for all intents and purposes, and so I don't know how we were going to squeeze another meeting in here. Is really what I'm saying. But that's certainly at your discretion. And I thanked you at the beginning for your indulgence. It's been a time in my department.
Yes.
The audit was very challenging, particularly with the auditors that we have. It's another whole conversation.
I wanted to add my sense of appreciation. Unless you've ever tried to write a 200-page book full of technical material, it's hard to realize what they put into this. Very well done.
And make no mistake, that is written by staff and not by the auditors. I think people are under the mistaken impression that the auditors do the CAFR. The only thing the auditors do in there is their letters and some assistance with the preparation of the financial statements, which are still a responsibility ultimately of staff. Unfortunately for me, during the time frame this was taking place, staff consisted relative to the audit of me. So we are a little, we're now have turned our attention to budget in earnest in the last few weeks, but we definitely have a little bit of an uphill road between now and the budget workshops to get some data together.
That we didn't call a meeting because of the intense pressure of the new auditor, where Cindy had to put all of her energy and her staff into writing this
report
textbook.
And teaching the auditors what was in there.
And the auditors, the new auditors, evidently have, were more of an advisory, and then they read it and make some edits as opposed to actually preparing the report. So,
Can I? Well, do you want me to elaborate on that or no? That's up to you.
Please.
Some of you were part of the selection of new auditors a couple of years ago, and we did that, and we hired what is certainly a very credible and qualified firm. Unfortunately, I would have to say my experience has been that firm has not provided me with their most qualified people. And, certainly a first-year audit is always a time of transition, and it's difficult, and the people that come on board have to learn, your new government. But certainly by the second year, you would expect some of that would be alleviated. Unfortunately, they have had a fair amount of turnover, and their replacements were this past year for the person that people that they turned over were completely unqualified in terms of their knowledge of municipal government audits. The product is good because the people at their firm ultimately responsible for the production of the audit are extremely qualified, but the field personnel, the people that were feet on the street and having daily interaction with my staff, really needed a lot more of my time and my staff's time than they should have had they been more knowledgeable in their field. So I guess that's the nicest way I can say that I've really kind of been a little disappointed in the quality of the resources that they've provided me, or in the quantity of the resources that they've provided me in terms of the amount of the workload that's been transferred to staff as opposed to the amount of the workload that's being done by the auditors as I would normally expect. That's I think the best way that I can say it. So certainly it's been a challenge.
Cindy, we in prior years we've never been involved in the budget process until after it's gone to the city council. Some of us on the committee thought maybe we ought to be a little forward in the deal. I have to admit, when I look at the budget, and here we are, and our capital structure is tight. There's any way you could kid ourselves, it's tight. And our ability to continue to raise taxes, it's just not there. I mean, we're going to struggle in my mind. But that being, there are some items in our expense area that we really need to look at, and I've said it before. I mean, the reality of the budget is it's about $13 million, excluding the transfers. And within that $13 million, and I know this is a pet project of everybody because we got people that are tied to it, and that's the recreation fund. I mean, I don't see how we can continue to support tax increases and yet spend roughly $3.9 million on the recreation operation. Now, I know that's partly the parks, but when we took the parks out and said, okay, the maintenance is going to be over here and the variables are going to be over here, and we were still spending $2 million on the variables. Now, I have to think, guys, that when we're in a tight economy with not a lot of upside, what we have got is the same as every other government does, allies that are stuck hanging on to that $2 million and be damned if they're going to give any of it up. And we got 15,000 people in town, 17,000 people. And we got a $3.9 million recreation fund.
But there's 140,000 people in the county and all the tourists who are non-performing in terms of
but the taxpayers pay this. The city guys pay it, and we're giving up. Look, what are we doing? We can't fix the streets, but we can beautify the parks. Now, something's wrong with this analysis. When people are driving down the street and going through rut holes, right? That tells me something. And we're making these trade-offs. And I, for one, really think we got to look hard at some of these expenditures. We can't. And look, I've been around, 3 years now? Trying to change the police department's budget. Look, if you want to go out and get your wisdom teeth pulled, it's going to be easier. That's not going to be easy. They don't change. There's not much flesh in this thing. When you tear apart the budgets, and I know Dick sometimes agrees with me, tear apart the budget, 75-80% of it's all payroll. You get maybe 10%. You look at the police department's budget, heck, they were driving around junkers. I mean, because there's no money left in the budget. And I personally think we're going to have to get hard-nosed about some of this, and maybe that record fund is going to have to be chiseled down by a couple $100,000. I don't care. Why are they Sanko? They shouldn't be. Not when the taxpayers are paying it. And when we give up funding the long-term liabilities to doing other things that we shouldn't, that I know we'd like to do, but like I tell my wife, I don't care if you do want a new pair of shoes. The reality is the budget is there. You can't have them.
Certainly,
Glenn, going back to your first point, could we get a preliminary budget earlier than?
I'd like to see it earlier.
Yeah, but let me tell you, and we've had this conversation. I think we had it last year, and this is what the city manager and I would both tell you. By the charter, it is the city manager's responsibility to prepare and submit a budget to the council, and so that is what we do first. Mm-hmm. Then once that he has provided his proposed budget, because it is by charter his proposed budget to the city council, and they've expressed their opinion about whether certain things in there that will or will not fly at all, they always send it back to you, the Finance Commission, for further recommendations. But that's the proper order of business, given it's the city manager's budget.
We really have not had much impact. When do we normally
get that? And when does it come?
Workshops, the council workshops will be July, and then you normally get it end of July, first part of August, before it gets adopted in September.
That's what we got to do then.
Yeah, no, I had asked.
Got to follow the state law.
It's minor impact. That's all.
Yeah, I had asked Jim, and one of the councilmen had asked me, would we recommend looking at the budget prior? I brought it to Jim, and he gave me the answer that Cindy just said, that it's under code that it's required to go first to the council.
Is that under city code or state?
That's the charter. The city's charter says the city manager prepares and submits his annual budget and budget message to the council. So, it's his budget proposal to the city council, and then once city council has received that from him, then their normal process is to then remit it back to the various commissions. And you're not the only ones. I mean, they have Recreation Commission look at the recreation part, which I would probably submit to you. The Recreation Commission's opinion of that particular budget is different than the Finance Commission's. But, a Marine Commission gets involved in the marina budget. So all the commissions have a look at their respective areas of concern, and then those recommendations come back to council before their final adoption and get incorporated before the final adoption.
And that's why
the council has to adopt the budget in September?
In September.
That's by state law?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to set the millage. But that's why I was saying, if nothing else, I would like to, prior to the budget, express what our priority concerns are, even without great detail, just to be in compliant to our responsibilities. And I wanted to be responsible to a council member who had asked me to bring this up.
Well, I think we all know going forward the budget's going to be exceedingly tight this next year. It can't be anything different, right?
I agree.
And so some of the things, if we get even 300,000, I think we tried for 300,000 last year on the other benefit program.
It'll take about 350 in the general fund from last year's numbers. It's probably about the same.
Right.
Yeah, the valuation came in about the same.
That was blown away.
But I will tell you again, if you look at the last meeting or the first meeting, the direction that there was very specific direction given by each council member to Jim and I regarding what they would like to see in their budget come July. So he put that on a formal council agenda and received some direction from council. They want us to try to get the OPEB in. They want us to address the infrastructure funding and those various problems. They want us to make sure the pensions are funded properly and a laundry list of other things. Addressing mostly the capital projects, and the stated goal of at least one person was also no tax increase. So we have some marching orders that we're using to prepare this budget to the best of our ability. So the inclusion of OPEB was one of them.
Yeah.
So the problem.
Cindy, at this point, is there a list of capital projects and what the expected cost is?
We're working on those right now.
Is that something you could submit to us?
We're working on those right now. Again, the way this works is we have internal reviews, and then the city council workshops are July the 13th, 14th, and 15th, I believe. Don't quote me, the end of that week. And my intention is to have the package out the week before, as we normally do. And between now and then, it's a work in progress.
The problem is, that, at least I followed it as the direction that was given to Jim, Cindy, and the staff was from the council a number of directions to fund. When I heard the number of whether it's the stormwater or whether it's OPEB or making the pension whole or whatever, all of a sudden maintaining recreation services, I don't see how, without increasing the budget substantially in some areas, that can occur.
Do you mean increasing the millage? Is that what you're saying?
No. All I'm saying, if with the input that has been given and direction, when they add up all of the different numbers, it's going to be greater than a nominal increase, in my view, of the budget, and that's going to have to be handled.
Well, again, it's a work in progress. It's what we do every year. You put it all in the hopper and you see what happens. And it's the time of year when the council, unfortunately, as always, will be faced with difficult decisions about priorities, because everyone has competing priorities. Certainly, there are people for whom the recreation program or the police department are essential in their eyes. But we've got. I'd say, if I had to guess, having begun to work seriously with the numbers, probably the biggest challenge is going to be infrastructure. We're doing our best, but we have a limited amount of money. Certainly selling Dodgertown or some of these other things would help. From an operating budget standpoint, I feel like we've reached a fairly level. We cut staff for a long time, and we seem to be in a pretty fairly level place, and we'll have to deal with health insurance increases and some of those natural increases. But I really think the bigger challenge in terms of competing priorities this year may well be trying to decide what to do with our limited capital money and how to fund projects that we need.
We have not gotten the final study yet on the stormwater deal.
Still waiting on
How
that.
far are we on that?
I believe
That's supposed to be finalized.
that they're scheduled to bring back the next level of the data sometime in the next few months. But again, at that point, well, again, what will happen is the stormwater projects that we think are critical will be part of the 1 cent sales tax fund because there is no stormwater utility. If and when the stormwater utility gets adopted and that revenue source is created, then we would amend the budget to then move those projects over, or however, whatever council decides to do in mid-July. But until that utility exists, it can't be budgeted against. There is no source of revenue. So we're going to throw all the capital projects in the pile and begin assessing our priorities in terms of what gets done. So it's budget season. On that side, I think it will. I think it absolutely will. But there's just a lot of need for infrastructure improvement and a limited source of funds. So it'll be challenging as always.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Do we have any objections?
No.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.